Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that summer day in 1976. I was 12, and my younger brother Michael was 9. We lived on this big piece of land in North Bend, Washington, right at the base of Rattlesnake Ridge. Our property was this mix of cleared pastures for our cattle and thick forest areas that seemed to stretch forever up the mountainside. That particular day started like any other summer day off from school. Mum was busy canning vegetables from our garden, and Dad was working with Grandpa at the logging site about 20 miles away. They wouldn't be back until dinner time. It was just after lunch when Michael and I headed out to play in what we called the lower pasture. This area, about 400 feet downhill from our house, where the cleared land met the forest edge. The lower pasture was our favorite spot because of these young, older trees that grew along the forest line. They were perfect for climbing, flexible enough that when you got to the top, you could swing down by riding the branches to the ground. Sometimes they'd snap and we'd fall, but it was never too high to really hurt yourself. Just high enough to feel that rush, you know? I remember the weather was perfect that day. Warm but not hot, with those big fluffy clouds floating across the blue sky. The kind of day where you just want to be outside until Mum calls you in for dinner. Michael and I had been playing on the trees for maybe an hour or so. We had this competition going to see who could ride a branch the farthest without it breaking. I was winning naturally. Being the older brother has its advantages, especially the extra 30 pounds that made the branches bend more under my weight. "Tommy, watch this one!" Michael called from his tree about 15 feet from mine. He was climbing a skinny alder that I knew wouldn't hold his weight near the top. I'd become pretty good at judging which trees could take our weight and which ones couldn't. Growing up around Grandpa's logging operations, you learn the way different woods sound when they're about to give. "That one's too thin, dummy!" I shouted back. "It's gonna snap!" But Michael, stubborn as always, kept climbing. Right on cue, when he was about 12 feet up, the tree bent sharply, and there was that familiar crack, the sound of green wood splitting under stress. Michael jumped off, laughing as he landed in the tall grass. "Told you!" I hollered, already eyeing my next target. A thicker alder a few yards deeper into the tree line. I was halfway up when we heard it. At first I thought maybe a tree had fallen somewhere in the forest. Living near logging country, you get used to that sound. The crack, the rushing noise through branches, and then the boom when it hits the ground. But this was different. This wasn't just one tree falling. It was a series of sounds, branches snapping, underbrush crushing, the unmistakable sound of something big moving through the forest. And it wasn't just moving, it was pushing through, breaking everything in its path. I froze where I was, about 10 feet up in the tree. Michael had started climbing his next tree, but stopped too. We both turned toward the sound, which was coming from deeper in the forest, maybe 100 yards away. "You hear that?" I whispered, though I don't know why I whispered. Whatever was making that noise was too far away to hear me. Michael nodded, his eyes wide. The sounds continued, getting louder. It wasn't a constant noise, but more like heavy movements followed by pauses, then more crashing. Not like a deer or even a black bear. We'd seen plenty of those on our property over the years. This was something much bigger. "Is it a bulldozer?" Michael asked. That made sense at first. The power behind the sounds reminded me of the equipment Grandpa used for clearing land. But then I realized there was no engine noise, no mechanical growl or diesel rumble, just pure physical force breaking wood. What happened next is still burned into my memory. The crashing sounds suddenly moved faster, more deliberate, coming directly toward us. I'm not exaggerating when I say you could feel the ground vibrate slightly with each impact. By now, I'd slid down from my tree and was standing next to Michael, both of us frozen in place. The sound stopped abruptly, and I swear it couldn't have been more than 30 yards away from us, just inside the dense tree line where we couldn't see. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. It was that heavy quiet that tells you something is holding still, listening. Michael grabbed my arm and squeezed so hard it hurt. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice shaking. I opened my mouth to say I didn't know, but before I could get the words out, it happened. The roar. God, that roar. I've tried for years to describe it to people, but words just fail. It wasn't like a bear or a cougar or anything I'd ever heard an animal make. It was deeper, more powerful. It started low and then rose in both volume and pitch until it felt like my whole body was vibrating from it. I could feel it in my chest, like when you stand too close to the speakers at a concert, but 1,000 times more intense. The sound hit us like a physical force. I actually stumbled back a step. Michael started crying instantly, not even the usual build-up of sniffles and whimpers, just straight to terrified sobbing. I don't remember making a conscious decision to run. 1 second we were standing there, and the next we were sprinting up the hill toward our house. I grabbed Michael's wrist and practically dragged him along. He was faster than me usually, but fear had turned his legs to jelly. The grass was tall in parts of the pasture, whipping against our legs as we ran. I remember thinking that if I tripped, whatever made that sound would get us both. That thought made me run even faster, my lungs burning and my heart feeling like it might explode. I didn't look back, not once. I don't know if Michael did, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around. Everything in me was focused on getting to the house, getting inside, getting safe. As we ran, I kept expecting to hear crashing behind us, to feel hot breath on my neck or giant hands grabbing at my shirt. But there was nothing except the sound of our own panicked breathing and feet pounding the dirt. We burst through the back door of the house, slamming it shut behind us and locking it in one frantic motion. Mom was at the kitchen counter, her hands covered in flour from the bread she was making. "What in heaven's name?" she exclaimed, turning to see us both red-faced, sweating, and in Michael's case, still crying. "There's something in the woods," I gasped, trying to catch my breath. "Something big! It roared at us!" Mum wiped her hands on her apron and came over to us. "Slow down, Tommy. What are you talking about?" Between gasps for air, I explained what we'd heard. The crashing through the trees, the roar that shook our bodies. Michael nodded vigorously beside me, finally finding his voice. "It was like a monster, Mum. I felt it in my bones when it roared." Mom frowned, looking from me to Michael and back again. I could tell from her expression that she didn't believe us. Not really. "Probably just a black bear," she said, brushing flour from Michael's hair where he'd pressed against her. "They can sound awful scary when they want to. Or maybe some of the Johnson boys playing a prank on you with their dad's hunting calls." "Mom, it wasn't a bear," I insisted. "I know what bears sound like. This was bigger. And the Johnsons live 5 miles away," Michael added. "It wasn't them." Mom sighed, that sigh parents give when they think their kids are being dramatic. "Well, whatever it was, you're safe now. But maybe stay closer to the house for the rest of the day, okay?" That night at dinner, we told Dad about what happened. Unlike Mum, he didn't immediately dismiss it, but he didn't seem too worried either. "Could have been a lot of things," he said thoughtfully, passing the potatoes. "Old-growth trees sometimes crack and fall in sections, makes all kinds of racket. As for the roar, well, sound carries funny in these mountains. Could have been a landslide on the backside of the ridge." But I could tell from the way his eyes narrowed slightly that he wasn't entirely convinced by his own explanation. Dad knew these woods better than anyone, except maybe Grandpa. If he couldn't readily identify what we'd heard, that meant something. After dinner, I overheard Mom and Dad talking in low voices in the kitchen. "You don't really think it was just a bear, do you?" Mom asked. There was a pause before Dad answered. Probably not, but no sense worrying the boys more than they already are. What do you think it was, then? Another pause. Don't know for sure, but Bill Jensen over in Fall City said his cattle got spooked by something last month. Found footprints bigger than any man's by his creek. You're not saying you believe those old Bigfoot stories? Dad sighed. I'm not saying anything, just that there's things in these mountains we don't understand. That night, I couldn't sleep. My bedroom window faced the forest, and I kept imagining I could see something huge moving between the trees at the edge of our property. Every creak of the house settling made me jump. I finally dragged my blanket and pillow into the hallway and slept on the floor outside my parents' bedroom. The next morning, Dad found me there when he got up for his early chores. "Rough night, huh?" he asked, his voice gentle. I nodded, embarrassed, but still too scared to pretend otherwise. He helped me up and put his hand on my shoulder. "Listen, Tommy, I've got to check the fence line down by the lower pasture this morning. Want to come with me? Sometimes the best way to handle being scared of something is to go look at it in the daylight." Part of me wanted to refuse, to never go near that pasture again. But a bigger part wanted to prove I wasn't a little kid who could be scared away from his own property. So I nodded. As we walked down the hill, the morning dew soaking our boots, Dad handed me his spare hunting knife. "Just in case," he said casually, but the weight of the knife in my hand made my stomach tighten. We spent an hour walking the edge of the forest where Michael and I had been playing. Dad examined the trees, looking for broken branches or any sign of what we'd heard. I stayed close to him, jumping at every sound. We didn't find anything conclusive, a few broken branches that could have been anything, some flattened grass that Dad said was probably just where deer had bedded down. But as we were heading back to the house, Dad stopped suddenly, staring at something on the ground. It was a partial footprint in a patch of mud near the stream that ran through our property. The toe section was clear, but the heel had been washed away by water. It was huge, easily twice the size of Dad's boot. And the toes, they didn't look right. Not like a bear's paw or anything I recognized. Dad stared at it for a long time, then deliberately scuffed it with his boot, erasing it. "Dad, why'd you do that?" He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Some things are better left alone, Tommy. I don't want your mum or Michael getting more worried." We never talked about that footprint again, but from that day on, I noticed Dad started carrying his rifle whenever he went to check the more remote parts of our property. As for Michael and me, we never went back to play in the lower pasture. Never. We found other places to climb trees and other games to play. But those older trees, the ones we'd spent countless summer hours on, might as well have disappeared from the earth for all we cared to go back there. The worst part came later, when school started back up in the fall. My chores included feeding the cattle before the bus came. In the early morning, especially as the days got shorter, I'd have to go out while it was still dark, carrying a flashlight and lugging feed buckets to the cattle pen, which was unsettlingly close to that lower pasture. Every morning, I'd feel eyes on me from the darkness. Every morning, I'd hurry through my chores, constantly looking over my shoulder. And sometimes, not often, but enough to keep the fear fresh, I'd hear branches breaking in the forest, never as loud as that day, but enough to let me know that whatever had been there was still watching. I'm 57 years old now, and I still won't go into dense forest alone. My wife thinks I'm being ridiculous, but she didn't hear that roar. She didn't feel it shake her bones and rattle her chest. She didn't see the look on my dad's face when he found that partial footprint and chose to destroy it rather than explain it. Whatever was in those woods that day wasn't something that belonged in our world of school buses and TV shows and normal family life. It was something older, something that reminded me that humans haven't always been at the top of the food chain. Sometimes I wonder if we still are. That is into Story 2. I've never told this story outside my immediate family. Even now, more than 40 years later, I get this crawling feeling up my spine when I think about it. I'm still not sure if sharing this is a good idea, but I need to get it off my chest. This happened back in 1980 or 81. I was 17 at the time. We lived in North Bend, Washington on this property that had been in our family for years. Our house sat on a small hill with a barn and pastures down below. My bedroom was on the second floor, and I had this big window right above my bed that looked out toward a stand of trees about 20-25 feet away. There was a dirt road that ran between the house and those trees, leading down to the barn. That window never had blinds. My parents always talked about installing some, but they never got around to it. Most nights, I didn't mind. I liked looking at the stars when I couldn't sleep. But after what happened that night, I covered that window with blankets until the day I moved out. What makes this whole thing even weirder is that it wasn't my first experience with whatever it was out there. A few years earlier, my brother and I had been playing in those same woods when we heard these ungodly roars and sounds of trees breaking. We ran back to the house so fast I thought my lungs would burst. My dad brushed it off as logging equipment, but we knew better. The sounds were too alive, too angry. But what happened that night was worse, much worse. It was around 1:45 in the morning when I woke up needing to pee really bad. I remember looking at my alarm clock with that red digital display and thinking about how much I didn't want to get out of my warm bed. My bathroom was down the hall, and our house was always freezing at night. I finally convinced myself to get up, and as I swung my legs over the side of the bed, I glanced out the window. It was pure instinct. I wasn't expecting to see anything. The moon was incredibly bright that night, almost like a spotlight on the yard. And that's when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. There was this figure walking, but not like anything I'd ever seen before. It was huge. I mean, impossibly big. My first thought was, maybe it's the neighbor's kid, which sounds ridiculous now because this thing was massive. It was walking with these enormous strides across our property, moving with this weird smoothness that didn't seem right. I just sat there, completely frozen. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even blink. As it moved into the full moonlight, I got a better look. This thing had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe even 10. Its shoulders were so wide, like 4 or 5 feet across. I swear it was as wide as a sheet of plywood. And its chest, Jesus, its chest was thick, like at least 3 feet from front to back. Nothing human is built like that. Nothing. We had this fence near the tree line, a standard 5-foot fence that my dad had put in years ago. This thing stood at least 2 feet taller than that fence. The top of the fence only came up to about mid-ribs on it, and the way it moved, it crossed our road in just 2 strides. 2. That's a standard width road, and this thing just glided across it like it was nothing. The movement is what still haunts me. It wasn't lumbering or awkward like you'd expect something that big to be. It moved with this controlled, almost floating gait, smooth, deliberate, like it was barely touching the ground. Its arms swung slightly with each step, but not in a wild way. Everything about its movement was precise. The whole encounter lasted maybe 5 to 10 seconds. It walked right through my entire field of vision, from one side of the window to the other. I could only see it from about the chest up because of the angle of my window. It never turned toward the house, never gave any indication it knew I was watching. As soon as it was out of sight, I reached over and flipped my alarm clock face down. I don't know why. It was just instinct. I was terrified that the red glow might somehow alert it to my presence. All I could think was that if it saw me, it could reach right through my window and grab me. That window suddenly felt like the flimsiest barrier in the world. I had to pee so badly my bladder was cramping, but there was no way in hell I was leaving that room. I just laid there, completely still, afraid that any movement or sound would bring it back. I stayed like that until sunrise, maybe 5 hours later. It was the longest night of my life. When morning finally came, I practically ran to the bathroom, then went straight to my parents' room. My mum was already up making breakfast. I tried to tell her what I'd seen, but I was shaking so hard I could barely get the words out. When I finally managed to explain, she gave me this look. Not disbelief exactly, but concern, like she was worried about my mental state. My dad was more receptive. He'd grown up in that area and had heard stories his whole life. He took me outside later that day to look for tracks, but it had rained lightly in the morning, and the ground was too muddy to show clear prints. All we found were some broken branches along the path where I'd seen it walking. The breaks were high up, like 7 or 8 feet off the ground. Dad didn't say much, but I could tell he was unsettled. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake listening for any sound outside my window. The smallest crack or rustle would send my heart racing. I started sleeping with a baseball bat beside my bed, though what good that would have done against something that size, I don't know. What bothers me the most, even now, is that I don't think it was just passing through. Something about the way it moved suggested purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going. I've wondered many times if it had been watching our house, studying our habits. Maybe it knew when we were asleep. Maybe it had been there before. On other nights, when I'd slept through its passing, I've tried researching similar sightings in North Bend over the years. There have been a few, enough to make me feel less crazy at least. A logger in 83 described something almost identical. A family in 79 abandoned their home after repeated visits from something they wouldn't describe to reporters. The area has a history of these encounters going back generations. Some people have suggested it was just a bear walking on its hind legs, but no bear moves like that. No bear has that body shape or that gait, and no bear stands 8 to 10 feet tall with shoulders like a linebacker on steroids. Others have told me it was probably just a man in a suit playing a prank, but you'd have to see the proportions to understand why that's impossible. No human has that build, and the movement, you can't fake that kind of fluid motion in a bulky costume. Besides, who would be wandering around rural Washington at 2 a.m. in a suit like that? I've heard all the Bigfoot stories and seen all the blurry photos and shaky videos. Most of them seem fake, or at least questionable to me, but what I saw that night was real. It was solid and three-dimensional and moving with purpose through my yard. I moved away from North Bend a few years later for college and never moved back. My parents stayed until they retired in the early 2000s. They never reported anything unusual after my sighting, but my mom did mention that our dog refused to go out at night for years afterward. He'd stand at the door, hackles raised, growling at the darkness. Smart dog. I've been back to visit a few times over the years. The last time was for my dad's funeral in 2018. I stayed in my old room, but I made sure to bring heavy curtains to hang over that window. I still didn't sleep well. The area has changed a lot. More development, more people. Maybe that's driven them deeper into the mountains, or maybe they've just gotten better at staying hidden. Either way, I know what I saw. I still have nightmares sometimes, not as often as I used to, but they still come. In them, I'm always back in that bed, looking out that window. But in the dreams, the creature stops. It turns. It looks right at me with eyes that seem to glow in the moonlight. Then it starts moving toward the house, toward my window. I always wake up before it reaches me, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. I've never been able to explain what I saw that night. I've run through every possible explanation, and none of them fit. All I know is that something enormous, something not human, walked through our property that night. And sometimes, when I'm camping or hiking in wooded areas, I get this feeling, this prickling sensation on the back of my neck that tells me I'm being watched. I don't turn around anymore. Some things you're better off not seeing twice. Story 3. I don't talk about this much, like at all. My buddies think I'm making it up. And honestly, sometimes I wish I was. But what happened that day in 2018 is burned into my brain, and I can't shake it no matter how hard I try. So I own this small cabin in northern Wisconsin. Nothing fancy, just a place to get away from the noise. I bought it after my second tour in Afghanistan, needed somewhere quiet where I could decompress. It's on about 40 acres of wooded land, mostly pine and oak, with a small creek running through it. Pretty isolated, which is exactly why I liked it. That weekend in late October 2018, I decided to head up alone. Just me and my pit bull Rocky. He's a good boy, solid muscle, but gentle as can be unless I tell him otherwise. The military training I put him through really took. He follows commands like a soldier. We've been inseparable since I got him as a pup. It was Friday night when we arrived. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s, and there was this damp chill in the air. You know that smell in fall when the leaves are rotting on the ground? That earthy, mushroomy scent was everywhere. I remember making a simple dinner, having a couple beers, and hitting the sack early because I wanted to explore my property in the morning. I woke up around 6 a.m. on Saturday. The sun was just starting to peek through the trees, casting these long shadows across the frost-covered ground. I made some coffee, threw together a quick breakfast of eggs and bacon, and packed a small backpack with water, some jerky, and a few other essentials. I also grabbed my .22 rifle, nothing special, just a Ruger 10-22 I'd use for plinking at cans or maybe taking a squirrel if I saw one. I've never been one for hunting big game, but I like target shooting, and the .22 is perfect for that. By 7:30, Rocky and I were heading out. The woods were quiet except for the occasional bird call and the crunch of leaves under my boots. Rocky was on his leash, nose to the ground, investigating every new scent. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. We'd been hiking for about an hour, following this old logging trail that cuts through my property. I was enjoying the crisp air, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees. Then Rocky stopped dead in his tracks. His whole body went rigid, and the hair on his back stood straight up. I've never seen him like that before. Not even when we encountered a black bear last summer. This was different. He was staring intently at something up ahead, giving this low, rumbling growl that I could feel more than hear. I scanned the area, but couldn't see anything unusual. Just trees, brush, the usual forest stuff. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement, something brownish moving down the ridge to our right. It was quick, just a flash, and I figured it was probably a deer. They're all over the place up there, and the movement seemed about right for that. I remember thinking, great, Rocky's getting all worked up over a deer. We continued on for maybe another 5 minutes. Rocky had calmed down a bit, but he kept looking back toward where we'd been. That's when it happened. Something hit the ground about 10 feet to my left. I flinched and looked down to see what it was, a piece of tree bark about the size of my hand. My first thought was that it had just fallen naturally, but there wasn't any wind. Then it clicked that someone might have thrown it. I remember feeling annoyed, thinking some kids might be trespassing on my property. I unclipped Rocky's leash, figuring he'd sniff out whoever was there and scare them off. He's intimidating to look at, even though he wouldn't hurt a fly without my command. "Hello?" I called out. "This is private property. If someone's there, you need to identify yourself." Nothing. Just silence, except for the sound of Rocky sniffing around in the underbrush. I shrugged it off and turned back toward the trail, and that's when I saw it. About 20 yards ahead of me stood... I don't even know how to describe it without sounding crazy. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and covered in dark brown hair that looked matted and dirty. But its face... Jesus, its face! It was this pale greyish colour, with wide lips and eyes that were completely black, like looking into empty space. The thing looked skinny, almost sickly, not muscular like you'd expect. My military training kicked in before my brain could even process what I was seeing. I raised my rifle to my shoulder, looking through the scope at this creature. I'm not going to lie, My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep it steady. For what felt like forever but was probably only 5 seconds, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was like my brain short-circuited. Finally, I managed to call out, "Rocky, come!" My voice sounded strange, higher than normal. Rocky came bounding back to my side, took one look at the thing, and started growling like I've never heard before. His whole body was trembling with this intense primal energy, but he didn't charge. His training held. I took one step forward, trying to make myself look bigger, hoping this thing would just turn and run. Big mistake. As soon as I moved, the creature seemed to make a decision. In one fluid motion, I swear to God, it leaped from a standing position straight up into a tree, not climbing, leaping, like 5 or 6 feet up, grabbing a branch that should have been impossible to reach. The agility of this thing defied everything I know about physics and human capability. From the tree, it broke off another piece of bark and hurled it down directly at Rocky. The bark hit him on the shoulder, and that was it for Rocky's restraint. He lunged forward, barking and snarling like a demon. I don't know what possessed me, but I fired a shot. The crack of the .22 seemed absurdly inadequate, like bringing a toy to a gunfight. I know I hit it. There was a flinch, a sound that was halfway between a grunt and a scream. But instead of falling or running away, this thing dropped from the tree and charged straight at me. Have you ever had a moment where time slows down? Where you can see everything with perfect clarity but can't move fast enough to react? That's what it was like. I could see its black eyes, the way its arms swung abnormally long at its sides, the way its feet barely seemed to touch the ground. I tried to chamber another round, but before I could, the creature veered away, heading down the ridge. Rocky was after it in a flash. I screamed for him to come back, but he was locked in pursuit mode. I saw him catch up to it, latch onto its leg with his jaws. The creature made this sound, not a scream or a roar, but this weird, high-pitched chittering noise that made my skin crawl. It swung its leg, sending Rocky flying through the air. My heart stopped when I saw my dog hit the ground hard, but immediately he was back on his feet. The thing took advantage of that moment to disappear into the thick brush. The whole encounter, from the moment I spotted it to when it vanished, couldn't have lasted more than 15 seconds. But it felt like hours. I ran to Rocky, terrified that he was seriously hurt. He was limping slightly with a few scratches and what would later turn into some nasty bruises, but was otherwise okay. I held onto his collar with one hand and kept my rifle ready with the other, scanning the woods, expecting the creature to return. But there was nothing, just the normal sounds of the forest slowly returning as if nothing had happened. I wish I could say I did the brave thing and tracked the creature, tried to get evidence or something. But the truth is, I was scared out of my mind. I just wanted to get back to the safety of my cabin, so we headed back, and I kept looking over my shoulder the entire way, jumping at every snapped twig and rustling leaf. When we got back, I locked every door and window, loaded my 9mm which I'd left at the cabin, and sat there with both guns within reach, trying to process what had just happened. I checked Rocky over thoroughly. He had a few scratches and was favoring his right hind leg, but nothing seemed broken. I gave him some extra treats and kept him close. I've spent countless hours since then trying to rationalize what I saw. Was it a bear standing on its hind legs? No way! The proportions were all wrong, and no bear moves like that. A person in a costume, in the middle of nowhere on private property, and no costume explains the inhuman way it moved or jumped. I know what I saw. It was a Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. And it wasn't the gentle forest giant from the beef jerky commercials. This thing was aggressive, intelligent, and predatory. I haven't told many people about this. My brother thinks I was hallucinating from PTSD or something. My hunting buddies laugh it off as a good campfire story. The few times I've tried to explain it to someone new, I can see them mentally backing away, like they're afraid my crazy might be contagious. I've been back to the cabin many times since then, never found any evidence. No footprints, no hair, nothing. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I look at Rocky, and I know. He remembers too. Whenever we hike that section of the property, he stays close to my side, alert and watchful in a way he isn't anywhere else. I've seen some scary shit in my life, war zones, firefights, but nothing has ever shaken me like those 15 seconds in the woods. What keeps me up at night isn't just what I saw. It's knowing that it's still out there, and knowing that if I ever told anyone the full truth, they'd think I'd lost my mind. So I keep it mostly to myself, but I don't hike without my rifle anymore. And I always watch the trees. Story 4. I've never shared this before. Not online, not with friends, not even with most of my family. Only my mum and dad know, and even Dad doesn't fully believe us. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. This happened back in October 2015. I was 16, and my mum and I were living in northern Pennsylvania, right on the edge of the Allegheny National Forest. Our house was super isolated, like the nearest neighbor was about half a mile away, and there were only 3 other homes anywhere close by. The rest was just thick woods, tons of oak, maple and pine trees that went on forever. In the fall, it was beautiful with all the colors, but also kind of eerie how dense and dark it got. We had this routine where Mum and I would go for evening drives to spot deer. There was this abandoned development not far from our property, just overgrown gravel roads cutting through the forest where someone had planned to build houses years ago, but never did. The deer loved to hang out there at dusk, and we'd count how many we saw. It was our thing. That particular evening, we'd had this massive storm roll through, like seriously heavy rain all day that finally let up around 6 p.m. Everything was soaked, branches and leaves all over the roads. The air had that super fresh, earthy smell you get after a big rainfall. Mum suggested we do our usual drive to see if any deer were out after the storm. Our Jeep Cherokee handled the muddy roads fine. We were used to it. The tracks were more washed out than normal, but nothing we hadn't seen before. We'd been driving for maybe 20 minutes, going slow, windows cracked despite the dampness, because we liked to listen for movement in the woods. The light was fading fast, making the forest look like it was closing in around us. We rounded this bend in the road, and there it was, a massive oak tree completely blocking our path. It must have come down during the storm. The root system was partly exposed, creating this massive dirt wall on one side of the road. The tree itself stretched all the way across and into the woods on the other side. "Guess this is as far as we go," Mom said, starting to make a 3-point turn to head back. That's when it happened. As she turned the car around, the headlights swept across the area where the tree had fallen, illuminating the broken stump and surrounding area. I almost didn't process what I was seeing at first. My brain couldn't make sense of it. Standing right beside the broken tree stump was something massive, something that shouldn't exist. It was tall, so tall, at least 7 feet, probably more. It had these incredibly broad shoulders and a build that looked powerful even under all the hair. And the hair, God, the hair. Long, shaggy, yellowish-white hair covered its entire body. The rain had made it wet and clumpy, hanging in these matted strands. What hit me hardest, though, was its face. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen, flat, with this broad nose and eyes that were set deep into its face. Those eyes caught the headlights and reflected back at us, like a deer's eyes do, but more intense, more aware. The weirdest part was its neck, or lack of one. Its head just seemed to sit directly on those massive shoulders, giving it this hulking, inhuman appearance. It didn't move. That's what keeps coming back to me in my nightmares. It just stood there, completely still, staring directly at us. Not aggressive, not running away, just watching, assessing. I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. My mom made this sound, not quite a scream, more like all the air leaving her body at once. She slammed the car into reverse so hard I thought the transmission might break. We shot backward down that narrow, muddy road, branches scraping along both sides of the car. The headlights kept that thing illuminated until Mom managed to straighten out enough to turn around properly. Even as we reversed away, it never moved, never charged us or ran away, just kept staring with those reflective eyes. The entire drive home, we didn't say a word. My hands were shaking so bad I had to sit on them. Mom's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. When we finally got back to our house, she locked all the doors and closed all the blinds before she finally looked at me. "Did you see that?" she asked. Her voice was trembling. All I could do was nod. "We don't tell anyone about this," she said. "They'll think we're crazy." And she was right. I knew she was right. Because what we saw standing there in the headlights that night was a Sasquatch. A real, actual Sasquatch. Just writing that makes me feel ridiculous, like I'm making up some campfire story. For days afterward, I kept expecting to hear something outside our house at night. I'd wake up at the smallest sounds, a branch against the window, the house settling, the wind. I'd lie there frozen, wondering if it had followed us home somehow. Mom was the same way. We both kept checking the locks, peering through the blinds at the edge of the woods behind our property. The thing is, we're not the type of people who believe in this stuff. We're not conspiracy theorists. Mom doesn't even like science fiction movies. We're practical people. I've been hunting since I was 12. I know what animals look like in the wild. I know what a bear looks like, even standing up. This wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. It wasn't anything that should exist in those woods. After a couple of weeks, we started to talk about it between ourselves, going over every detail, trying to find some explanation that made sense. Maybe it was a bear with mange. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion caused by the fallen tree and the shadows. But we both knew what we'd seen. The image was burned into my brain. Those eyes reflecting our headlights, that massive frame, that yellowish-white hair. About a month later, Mom finally told my dad. He'd been working out of state and came home for Thanksgiving. He listened to us, and I could tell he was trying to believe us because he trusted us, but I could also see the doubt in his eyes. He suggested maybe it was a bear, with some kind of skin condition that made it lose its fur. Or maybe someone playing a prank with a costume. But who would be out there in the middle of nowhere, in the pouring rain, just standing by a fallen tree on the off chance someone might drive by? It made no sense. For a long time, I was afraid to go back into those woods alone, which was a problem because I loved hunting. Eventually, I forced myself to get past it. Life went on. We never told anyone else. The weirdest part came a few years later. I was at a friend's house, and they put on this documentary about cryptid sightings. I nearly had a panic attack when they showed an artist's rendering of a Sasquatch that looked eerily similar to what we'd seen, right down to the yellowish-white hair and the absence of a distinct neck. Apparently, there had been other sightings in the Appalachian region of creatures matching that description. I've tried researching it since then, carefully, without telling anyone why I'm interested. There are reports scattered throughout Pennsylvania, New York, and West Virginia of similar sightings. Some people call it the Pennsylvania white Bigfoot or other regional names. The descriptions are consistent enough to be unsettling. I've continued hunting throughout those areas for years now. I've spent countless hours in the woods of Pennsylvania, New York, and West Virginia. I've seen all kinds of wildlife, bears, coyotes, bobcats, you name it. But I've never again seen anything like what Mom and I encountered that rainy October night. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, watching from the tree line when humans venture too deep into its territory. I wonder if it remembers us the way we remember it. I wonder what would have happened if Mom hadn't reacted so quickly, if we'd been stuck there with that fallen tree blocking our path. The logical part of my brain still tries to explain it away. Maybe it was the stress of the storm, the fading light, the isolation. Maybe our minds played tricks on us, but then I remember those eyes reflecting our headlights, the way it stood so perfectly still, the absolute certainty I felt in that moment that we were looking at something that wasn't supposed to exist. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. Honestly, I'm not sure I would believe it if someone else told me this story. All I know is what my mum and I saw that night was real. It was standing there by that fallen tree, watching us with intelligent eyes that reflected our headlights. And no matter how much time passes, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there somewhere in those dense woods, just waiting. I still drive those back roads sometimes when I visit home. I never go down that particular abandoned development road anymore, though. Some things are better left alone, but every time I'm in those woods, especially as the light fades, I catch myself scanning the tree line, just in case. Story 5. I've been sitting on this experience for about 7 years now. I've told a few close friends, my girlfriend at the time, but never shared it publicly. People think you're crazy when you talk about this stuff, but I need to get this off my chest. This happened back in fall 2016. I was a junior at Penn State, and my girlfriend's mom lived about 4 miles from campus in this rural-ish area. Lots of woods, fields, and scattered houses. There wasn't much out there, just these stretches of darkness between pockets of civilization. That night, I'd been at my girlfriend's mom's place for dinner. Nothing special. Just a normal Sunday evening. Around 10 p.m., I decided to head back to my apartment. I had my mountain bike, which I used constantly to get around campus and town. The route back wasn't complicated, but it cut through some pretty isolated spots. There weren't many streetlights, maybe one every quarter mile or so. It was chilly, typical Pennsylvania fall weather. I remember wearing a hoodie under my jacket and wishing I'd brought gloves, because my fingers were getting numb on the handlebars. The ride was quiet, almost no cars, that kind of silence where you can hear your own breathing and the crunch of leaves under your tires. About halfway back to campus, I noticed my front brake was rubbing against the wheel. Super annoying sound, and it was making me pedal harder than I needed to. There was a 4-way intersection with a single streetlight, so I stopped there to fix it. I flipped my bike upside down on the roadside and started adjusting the brake caliper. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was someone walking through the field across from me, but the footsteps sounded off. They were heavy, like unnaturally heavy. Each step made this deep, muffled thud that you could almost feel. Not like a person jogging or even a large man walking. These were different. I remember pausing and looking around but couldn't see much beyond the circle of light from the street lamp. The footsteps stopped when I stopped working on my bike. I figured it was probably a deer or something and went back to fixing my brake. Then a dog started barking from one of the nearby houses, one of those frantic, alarmed barks. Not the someone's at the door kind, but the something's wrong kind. That's when the hairs on my neck stood up. I quickly flipped my bike back over, wanting to get out of there. The brake wasn't perfectly aligned, but it would do. Just as I was about to hop on and leave, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time, much closer, and then it stepped into the light. I've gone over this moment in my head thousands of times, trying to convince myself I didn't see what I saw, but I can't unsee it. This thing was massive. At least 6 feet tall, probably taller. It was built like a linebacker, but bigger, way bigger, had to be over 400 pounds of solid mass. Its legs were thick, like tree trunks, covered in this pale, matted hair. But what really got me were the arms. When it dropped onto its knuckles, those arms stretched straight down. Abnormally long, not proportional to its body at all. Its head was wrong. There's no other way to describe it. It had this sloped skull that seemed to merge right into its shoulders, like it didn't really have a neck. Its eyes were deep-set, almost hidden under a heavy brow, but I could see them catching the streetlight, dark and aware. Its nose was broad and flat, and its mouth was disturbingly human-like, surrounded by darker hair. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It didn't fit into any category of animal I knew. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a person in a costume. It was something else entirely. Then it moved toward me. I've never experienced pure terror like that moment. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I jumped on my bike and started pedaling like my life depended on it, because I was convinced it did. The creature charged after me. I could hear it behind me, sometimes running upright on two legs, sometimes dropping to its knuckles. Each footfall literally made the ground shake. I'm not exaggerating. I could feel the vibrations through my bike. I was pedaling harder than I'd ever pedaled in my life. My legs were burning, my lungs were on fire, but the adrenaline kept me going. I didn't dare look back. I just kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, praying I wouldn't hit a pothole or something. It followed me for about 100 yards. I could hear it right behind me, this heavy breathing and those thunderous footsteps. Then, suddenly, the footsteps stopped. I risked a glance back and saw it standing there in the middle of the road, swaying slightly from side to side. It just watched me. Then, in one fluid motion, it jumped, and I mean jumped, over this stone wall on the side of the road and disappeared into the darkness beyond. I didn't stop. I kept riding until I reached the top of a hill about a quarter mile away. I circled around a few times, scanning in all directions, my heart feeling like it was about to explode out of my chest. There was nothing, no movement, no sound. After what felt like an eternity, I turned around and rode back to my girlfriend's mom's house as fast as I could. I wasn't about to continue to campus. When I got there, I practically fell off my bike in the driveway. My girlfriend came out, asking what was wrong. I was sweating despite the cold, shaking uncontrollably, and probably looked like I'd seen a ghost. I told them what happened. My girlfriend believed me. She could see how genuinely terrified I was. Her mom was skeptical, but concerned by my state. They drove me back to campus that night, taking the main roads instead of the back way I'd been biking. In the days that followed, I scoured the internet for any reports of unusual sightings in the area. I found a few vague accounts from hikers in central Pennsylvania describing similar creatures, but nothing concrete. I even anonymously called a local ranger station to ask if there had been any unusual wildlife spotted recently. They just mentioned some black bears, but this wasn't a bear. Bears don't run on their knuckles. They don't have that human-like quality, and they certainly don't move the way this thing moved. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. Every sound outside my window made me freeze. I stopped biking after dark completely. My friends noticed the change in me, but I only told a select few what happened. Most just assumed I'd had some kind of scare with a car or a regular animal. I've tried to rationalize it countless ways. Maybe it was just a large person with a weird gait. Maybe it was some kind of escaped exotic animal. Maybe the shadows and my tired mind played tricks on me. But none of those explanations satisfy what I saw and experienced that night. The way it moved wasn't natural. The intelligence in its eyes wasn't that of a regular animal. And the sheer size and strength of it. I've never seen anything like it before or since. I graduated from Penn State in 2018 and moved to Pittsburgh for work. I rarely go back to that area. Part of me wants to return in daylight to see if I can find any evidence, tracks, hair, anything. But a bigger part of me never wants to set foot on that road again. I still mountain bike, but never alone and never after sunset. I've become hyper-aware of my surroundings, always scanning tree lines and open fields. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, moving through the woods of central Pennsylvania. And sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I wonder if it recognized me as much as I recognized it as something that shouldn't exist in our world. I don't know what I encountered that night. Logically, I know what people call these creatures, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, but those names seem too cartoonish for the very real, very terrifying being I saw. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and for some reason, it decided to let me go. That's what keeps me up at night the most. Not just that these things exist, but that this one made a choice. It could have caught me easily. I'm certain of that. But it stopped. It watched me escape, and I have no idea why. I've never reported this officially. Who would I even tell? What would I say? Hey, I saw Bigfoot while fixing my bike. I'd be laughed out of any police station or wildlife office. So I'm sharing it here, anonymously, with people who might have experienced similar things. I don't have proof. I don't have answers. All I have is the memory of those few terrifying minutes that changed how I see the world. If you've seen something similar in central Pennsylvania or anywhere, I'd like to know I'm not alone, because 7 years later I still check over my shoulder when I hear heavy footsteps behind me, and I still can't explain what chased me that night. Story 6. I've been hesitating to share this for years. Even now, typing this out, my hands feel unsteady. I'm not someone who believes in the paranormal or cryptids. I'm just a regular guy who works in IT, pays taxes, and occasionally enters mountain biking competitions. I've never been one to jump at shadows or make up stories for attention. But what happened to me on October 18th, 2017, has been sitting in the back of my mind, making me question everything I thought I knew about the world we live in. That morning started like any other training day. I'd been preparing for a cross-country mountain biking race scheduled for the following month, so I was trying to get in as many trail miles as possible. Pine Hollow Wildlife Reserve near Fairview, Pennsylvania, has always been my go-to spot. It's got great elevation changes, technical sections, and it's usually pretty empty on weekdays. Plus, it's only about a 25-minute drive from my house, which makes it perfect for squeezing in rides after work or on days when I work from home. I remember it was a Wednesday because I'd taken a half-day off. The weather was perfect for riding, around 58 degrees, sunny, with just enough chill in the air to keep me from overheating on the climbs. I decided to bring my dog, Max, a 3-year-old shepherd lab mix who loves running alongside me on trails. He's a great training partner, always keeping pace and never wandering too far. I arrived at the reserve parking lot around 1:30 p.m. There were only 2 other cars there, probably hikers, since the mountain biking community is pretty small in our area. I geared up, let Max out of the car, and we set off on our usual route. The plan was to do about 15 miles, hitting the more technical sections twice to practice my line choices for the race. The first 45 minutes were uneventful. The trails were in great condition, not too muddy from the light rain we'd had the previous weekend, but not dusty either. Max was having a blast, running ahead a bit and then circling back to check on me. He's really well trained on trails and knows to stay close. I even remember feeling particularly good that day, like I was finally hitting my stride after weeks of training. My legs felt strong on the climbs, and I was clearing technical sections that had given me trouble before. Around 2:20 p.m., we crossed the fire road that cuts through the middle of the reserve. This is where things started to get strange. We were heading up a moderate climb that eventually leads to what local riders call the ravine. It's not particularly deep, maybe 20 feet at its deepest point, but it has some gnarly downhill sections with root drops and tight turns. I was about halfway up this climb, breathing hard but feeling good, when I noticed something odd in the distance. About 50 yards ahead and slightly off to the left of the trail, there appeared to be what I initially thought was a dirty white blanket hanging from a small tree. It caught my eye because it seemed out of place. Who would hang a blanket in the middle of the woods? It was kind of draped over a branch, and I remember thinking it was probably trash that someone had carelessly left behind. People sometimes dump things in the reserve, unfortunately, and I've occasionally reported larger items to the park rangers. As I continued climbing, still focusing mostly on maintaining my momentum up the hill, something happened that made my blood run cold. The blanket moved, not like it was being blown by the wind, but like it was adjusting itself. That's when I realized it wasn't a blanket at all. It was something alive. I instinctively squeezed my brakes and came to a stop. Max stopped too, which was unusual, because normally he'd be alert and focused on any wildlife we encountered. But he just stood there, looking ahead, but not reacting the way he typically would to a deer or coyote. From my position on the trail, I could see that what I had thought was a blanket was actually the back of something that had been crouching or hunched over. It had dirty, matted hair or fur that was primarily white or grayish in color, though parts of it were so filthy it looked almost brown in patches. As I watched, frozen in place, the thing seemed to sense our presence. It slowly turned, not its entire body, but just its upper portion, and then in one fluid motion it stood up. The height is what struck me first. This thing was tall, easily 7 feet, maybe more. It had a bulky frame that reminded me of a linebacker, but with proportions that weren't quite human. Its arms seemed too long, hanging lower than a person's would, and the way it moved when it stood, it's hard to describe, but it didn't move like a human does. It was both fluid and awkward at the same time, like its joints worked differently from ours. I didn't get a clear look at its face. It never fully turned toward me, but I could tell it was covered in the same dirty white or grey hair as the rest of its body. The hair wasn't uniform in length. It seemed shorter on some parts of its body and longer on others, especially along what I assumed was its back. The entire encounter probably lasted only 5 to 7 seconds, but it felt like time had slowed down. After it stood up, the creature took a few steps and then disappeared into the thicker brush to the side of the ravine. It didn't run exactly. It moved with this strange, loping gait that covered ground surprisingly quickly. It wasn't graceful, but it was efficient, like it knew exactly how to move through the forest undergrowth. What happened next still bothers me when I think about it. Max, who would normally be barking his head off at a deer or even a squirrel, didn't make a sound. He didn't growl, didn't bark, didn't even seem particularly interested. He just stood there, watching, as if what we were seeing was the most normal thing in the world. His lack of reaction almost freaked me out more than the creature itself. After the thing disappeared, I stayed put for probably another 30 seconds, just listening. The woods had gone completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling, nothing. That oppressive silence is something I'll never forget. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. Part of me wanted to turn around and head straight back to my car, but another part, the part that's always been too curious for my own good, wanted to investigate. I cautiously pedaled forward, keeping my eyes fixed on the spot where the creature had vanished. I kept telling myself it was probably just a person wearing some kind of ghillie suit or hunting gear, though deep down I knew that explanation didn't make sense. The movements were all wrong, and who would be hunting in a wildlife reserve where it's strictly prohibited? When I reached the edge of the ravine, I stopped and scanned the area. There was no sign of the creature, no movement in the underbrush, no sounds of retreat. I looked at the ground, hoping to find footprints or some other evidence, but the forest floor was covered with a thick layer of fallen leaves and pine needles that didn't show clear impressions. I remember calling out once, not a word, just a hello kind of sound, and immediately regretting it. The woods seemed to swallow my voice, and the silence that followed felt even heavier than before. Max stayed close to my side, which was unusual for him. Normally he'd be investigating scents and exploring, but he seemed hesitant to leave my side. I decided to check where I'd first seen the creature, where it had been crouching. I walked my bike over. The terrain was too rough to ride, with Max following closely. I was looking for anything, disturbed vegetation, hair caught on branches, anything that might confirm what I'd seen was real. But there was nothing obvious. The only thing I noticed was that some of the smaller plants in the area seemed to be pressed down, as if something heavy had been there recently, but that could have been caused by anything. After about 5 minutes of half-hearted searching, a sense of unease washed over me. I felt exposed and vulnerable, like I was being watched from multiple directions. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had this overwhelming urge to get out of there. I quickly got back on my bike and headed back the way we came, moving faster than was probably safe on those trails. Max kept pace easily, and he seemed just as eager to leave as I was. The ride back to the parking lot is mostly a blur. I know I didn't stop once, not even on the toughest uphill sections. I just wanted to get back to my car. The entire time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that tall, white figure following us through the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty forest and that persistent silence. When we reached the parking lot, there was only one car left besides mine. I loaded my bike onto the rack with shaky hands, got Max into the back seat, and sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes, trying to process what had happened. I considered going to the small ranger station at the entrance to report what I'd seen, but I kept asking myself, report what exactly? That I saw a dirty white 7-foot-tall creature that moved weirdly and disappeared into the woods, that my dog, who barks at squirrels, didn't react at all to this massive being. I knew how it would sound. So I drove home trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. But I've seen bears before, and this didn't move like a bear. Its proportions were all wrong for a bear too. A person in some kind of costume. But why would someone be out there in the middle of a weekday, wearing what looked like a filthy, matted suit? And the way it moved. I've never seen a human move that way. For weeks afterward, I avoided Pine Hollow. I made excuses to train elsewhere, telling myself it was because I wanted variety in my training. But really, I was scared. Not just of seeing the creature again, but of not seeing it, of confirming that I had imagined the whole thing or somehow misinterpreted something ordinary. When I finally returned to Pine Hollow about a month later, I brought a friend with me, and we stuck to the more popular trails. I never told him why I was being so cautious or why I kept scanning the woods as we rode. We didn't see anything unusual that day or on any of my subsequent rides there. Over time, I almost convinced myself that I had experienced some sort of weird hallucination. Maybe I was dehydrated, or maybe a combination of exertion and shadows had played tricks on my mind. I never told anyone about what I saw. Not my girlfriend, not my riding buddies, no one. I was afraid they'd think I was crazy or making it up for attention. Until 2021, I had pretty much filed the whole experience away as unexplained but probably nothing. Then, on a random Tuesday night, I was at Lakeview Bar with some co-workers after a company event. We got to talking with some locals, and one guy mentioned he was an avid hunter. When he said he hunted in the areas around Fairview, including some spots near Pine Hollow, my ears perked up. I casually asked if he'd ever seen anything strange in those woods. I expected him to laugh and tell a story about a weird-looking deer, or maybe a coyote. Instead, he got this serious look on his face and lowered his voice. "You're going to think I'm crazy," he said, "but 3 years ago, I saw something out there that I still can't explain. Like a white gorilla or something, standing at least 8 feet tall. Moved like nothing I've ever seen before." My stomach dropped. I asked him to describe it in more detail, trying to sound merely curious rather than desperate for confirmation. His description wasn't an exact match for what I'd seen. He described it as pure white rather than dirty greyish white, and he estimated it to be taller than what I saw. But the core details were too similar to be coincidence. The unusual gait, the disproportionately long arms, the way it moved through dense vegetation with ease. He mentioned that he'd seen it near a ravine on the eastern side of the reserve, which could very well have been the same area where I had my encounter. When I asked him if he'd reported it to anyone, he gave me the same answer I'd given myself years before. Who would believe him? That conversation shook me to my core. All the doubts I'd built up over the years came crashing down. Someone else had seen it too. Someone who had no connection to me, no reason to make up a story that matched mine so closely. Since then, I've done some research into Sasquatch or Bigfoot sightings in Pennsylvania. Most reported Bigfoot creatures are described as having dark brown or black hair, not white. There are some accounts of what cryptozoologists call white Bigfoot or Pennsylvania white Bigfoot, but they're rare. I've found a few other reports from the western Pennsylvania region describing similar creatures, but nothing definitive. I still ride at Pine Hollow sometimes, but never alone, and never with just Max. I always bring at least one other person, and I tend to stick to the more populated trails. I find myself constantly scanning the forest, both hoping and fearing that I'll catch another glimpse of whatever it was I saw that day. I don't know what I encountered on October 18th, 2017. I don't know if it was some unknown species, a person playing an elaborate prank, or something else entirely. All I know is that it was real. It was there, and to this day the memory of that dirty white figure standing up and disappearing into the woods still gives me chills. For those who ride or hike at Pine Hollow, keep your eyes open, and if you see something that looks like a dirty white blanket hanging from a tree, maybe go the other way. Ku Shun. Story 7. I've debated for weeks whether to share this. Most of you will think I'm lying or that I hallucinated the whole thing. I get it. I probably wouldn't believe me either. But I need to tell someone who might understand, because my wife is tired of hearing about it, and my friends have started giving me that look when I bring it up. This happened about 3 weeks ago. It was a Thursday night in late September. Nothing special about the day. I'd just put my son Tommy to bed around 8:30. He's 4 and fights sleep like it's his job. After our usual bedtime routine, 2 books, 1 song, 3 sips of water, and checking under the bed for monsters, he finally dozed off. I was exhausted, but wanted some time to myself before crashing, so I headed downstairs to grab a beer and watch whatever game was on. Our house sits at the edge of this small development that backs up to about 60 acres of woods. It's not remote by any means. We've got neighbors on both sides, but our backyard extends pretty far back before hitting the tree line. There's an old bike trail that runs through those woods, with a small gravel parking area about a quarter mile down the road. I was halfway down the stairs when I heard it, this deep, raspy cough coming from outside. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough that it stopped me mid-step. My first thought was that some teenager was messing with Tommy's inflatable pool that I'd left drying in the yard. We've had issues with kids from the next development over cutting through our property to get to the bike trail. I went to the hallway window that overlooks the backyard. The motion sensor light wasn't on, which struck me as odd if someone was out there. It was a clear night with a half moon, so I could make out the basic shapes. My shed off to the right, Tommy's swing set, the tree line about 50 yards back. I was about to dismiss the sound when something moved between the shed and the trees. At first I thought it might be a deer. We get them all the time, and they sometimes make weird noises. But this was no deer. It was a massive figure, standing upright. I couldn't make out details, but I could tell it was huge, way taller than any person I've ever seen. I squinted, trying to convince myself it was just shadows playing tricks on my eyes. Then it moved again, adjusting its stance, and I felt my heart slam against my ribs. I remembered the night vision scope I keep in my closet upstairs. I bought it years ago for hunting, but rarely use it. Without taking my eyes off the figure, I backed away from the window and raced upstairs as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking so badly I almost couldn't get the damn thing out of its case. When I got back to the window, I was terrified it would be gone, either proving I'd imagined it or worse, that it had moved closer to the house. But it was still there in the same spot, almost like it was waiting for something. I raised the scope to my eye, adjusted the focus, and nearly dropped the thing when the image cleared. It was at least 8.5 feet tall, maybe taller. Its proportions were all wrong for a human. Shoulders too broad, arms too long. The body was massive, not fat but powerfully built, covered in what looked like greyish hair or fur. Not matted or tangled like you'd expect, but not smooth either. But the face, Jesus, the face is what keeps me up at night. It was disturbingly human-like, but not. Deep-set eyes under a heavy brow ridge, a jaw that looked powerful enough to snap a baseball bat, a wide, flat nose. The hair on its face was shorter than on the rest of its body, which somehow made it worse, made the facial features more visible. It was standing completely still, staring up at the treetops like it was listening for something. I realized I was holding my breath and forced myself to exhale slowly. Through the scope, I could see its chest rising and falling with deep breaths. It was so clear, so detailed, there was no way I was imagining this. In the distance, I could hear music playing, a radio from the bike trail parking lot. Someone was there, probably getting ready to leave, and suddenly it hit me. This thing was waiting. It was waiting for people to leave. The realization sent ice through my veins. This wasn't random. It had positioned itself perfectly. In the shadows, where normal eyesight wouldn't pick it up, but with a clear view of both the trail access and my yard. It was being strategic. I watched it through the scope for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two. The way it stood, the way it breathed, there was an awareness there. Intelligence. This wasn't some animal operating on instinct. This thing was thinking. At one point it tilted its head slightly, like it was focusing on a sound. I didn't hear anything, but a moment later car doors slammed in the distance and an engine started up. The music I'd heard faded as the car drove away. I had to show someone else. I needed someone to confirm what I was seeing. I lowered the scope and ran to our bedroom to wake up my wife, Lisa. She's always been the practical one between us, the one who can explain away strange sounds and shadows. I desperately needed her to see this thing, to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. "Lisa," I whispered urgently, shaking her shoulder. "Lisa, wake up. You need to see something." She groaned and rolled over. "What time is it?" "It doesn't matter. There's something in the backyard. Something not normal." The annoyance in her voice was obvious. "Is it the Henderson's dog again? I told you to just spray it with the hose if it keeps digging in my garden." "It's not a dog," I insisted. "Just come look, please." She must have heard the fear in my voice because she sat up and reached for her glasses. "This better be good, Jack." By the time we got back to the hallway window, it was gone. I frantically scanned the yard through the scope, sweeping back and forth from the shed to the trees. But there was nothing there. No movement, no massive figure, nothing but the empty yard and the silent trees. "I swear to God it was just here," I said, still searching. "It was huge, like 8 feet tall at least, standing right by the tree line." Lisa rubbed her eyes. "What was? A bear?" "No, not a bear." I lowered the scope, my hands still trembling. I think it was a Sasquatch. The look she gave me, that mixture of concern and disbelief, is permanently burned into my memory. "Have you been drinking?" she asked. "No, I was going to grab a beer, but then I heard this cough outside." Even as I said it, I could hear how crazy it sounded. Lisa put her hand on my arm. "Jack, there's no such thing as Sasquatch. You probably saw a bear standing on its hind legs, or maybe it was just shadows." "It wasn't shadows," I insisted. "I saw it through the scope, clear as day. It had a face, Lisa, almost human, but not quite. It was watching, waiting for people to leave the bike trail." She sighed. "Come back to bed. You're exhausted and your eyes are playing tricks on you." I know what I saw. But even as I said it, doubt started creeping in. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Could I have somehow misinterpreted something normal? I couldn't sleep that night. I kept going back to the window, scanning the yard with the scope, hoping to catch another glimpse. Part of me was terrified it would return, while another part desperately wanted proof. The next morning, I went out to examine the area where it had been standing. I'm not sure what I expected to find. Footprints, I guess, or broken branches. Something to validate what I'd seen. But there was nothing obvious. The ground was too dry and hard for footprints, and if any twigs had been snapped, I couldn't distinguish them from normal forest debris. I did find one thing, though. About 10 feet into the tree line, right where it would have had to pass to leave, there was a small clump of greyish-brown hair caught on a branch. It wasn't much, just a few strands, but it was coarse and unlike any animal hair I was familiar with. I put it in a Ziploc bag, not really knowing what I planned to do with it. When I showed Lisa, she said it probably came from a deer or coyote. Maybe she's right. I still have it sitting in my desk drawer. Sometimes I take it out and look at it, wondering if I should send it somewhere for testing. But I'm afraid of the ridicule if I'm wrong, and maybe more afraid of what it means if I'm right. It's been 3 weeks, and I haven't seen it again. I've spent more nights than I care to admit sitting at that window with the scope, scanning the tree line, jumping at every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. I've started bringing the scope with me when I take out the trash after dark, or when Tommy wants to play in the yard as the sun is setting. Lisa thinks I'm becoming obsessive. She's probably right, but she didn't see what I saw. She didn't see those eyes, that face that was so wrong yet so eerily familiar. I keep replaying that night in my mind, trying to convince myself there must be a rational explanation. But every time I close my eyes, I see it standing there, this massive, intelligent creature that shouldn't exist, watching and waiting with unmistakable purpose. I've researched Sasquatch sightings since then. Most sound like bullshit, honestly. Blurry photos and second-hand stories, but a few descriptions match exactly what I saw. The height, the broad shoulders, the facial features. It makes me wonder how many other people have seen something they can't explain, something they're afraid to talk about for fear of being labeled crazy. I don't know why it was in our yard that night. I don't know if it's still out there in those woods. But I know what I saw, and it wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume, and it definitely wasn't shadows playing tricks on my eyes. Sometimes I wonder if it saw me too, if it knew I was watching it through that window. The thought keeps me up at night. I haven't told Tommy anything. He still plays in the backyard, still asks me to check under his bed for monsters. The irony isn't lost on me. I'm checking his closet for imaginary creatures, while a real one might be watching from the woods behind our house. Last weekend, we were grilling in the backyard, and Tommy stopped mid-run while playing tag with the neighbor's kid. He stood completely still, staring at the tree line. When I asked him what was wrong, he said, "I thought I saw a really tall man in the trees." I nearly dropped my beer. Lisa distracted him with the promise of s'mores, and he forgot all about it. I didn't. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm not even sure I'd believe this story if someone else told it to me. But I know what I saw that night. Something impossibly large, something that shouldn't exist, something intelligent enough to hide and wait and watch. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the house and the sun is setting, I swear I can hear that deep, raspy cough again, just beyond the tree line. Story 8. I still get chills thinking about what happened on December 22nd, 1993. Nearly 30 years have gone by, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I've only told a handful of people over the years. My ex-wife, who thought I was making it up, my brother, who believed me, and a couple close friends after too many beers. Most just give me that look, you know the one. But I know what I saw. I was driving my old Ford F-150 through Willow Creek, Montana, heading home after finishing up a carpentry job in the next county over. It was about 8 p.m. and brutally cold. The radio announcer had said -5 degrees, and I believed it. My truck's heater was struggling to keep up. I had the heat cranked all the way, wearing my heaviest winter coat, and I could still see my breath inside the cab. County Road 72 was completely deserted that night. No surprise given the weather and how close it was to Christmas. Everyone with any sense was already home with their families. I should have been too, but the job had run long, and I needed the money. The darkness out there was absolute. No streetlights, no houses, nothing but my headlights cutting through the pitch black, illuminating the snow-covered road ahead and the dense forest on either side. I was exhausted, having worked a 12-hour day, and was focusing hard on staying alert. The radio reception was garbage out there, just static with occasional fragments of Christmas songs breaking through. I'd been driving for about 40 minutes since leaving the job site when it happened. At first, I thought it was a moose or maybe a bear standing upright. This huge, dark shape suddenly appeared in my headlights, standing right in the middle of the road about 100 yards ahead. I hit the brakes hard, causing my truck to slide a bit on the slick surface. My heart was immediately hammering in my chest. As I got closer, maybe 50 yards away now, I could tell this wasn't any animal I recognized. It was standing on 2 legs, for one thing, and it was big, really big. I slowed to almost a complete stop about 30 yards away and flipped on my high beams to get a better look. That's when I saw it clearly, and I felt like all the air had been sucked out of my lungs. It was a massive figure covered in thick, matted hair, a mixture of dark brown and black. The hair seemed longer in some places, especially around the shoulders, and shorter on the face. It was standing there, leaning forward slightly, almost like it was hunched over from carrying too much weight or maybe nursing some kind of injury. The face. God, the face is what I remember most vividly. It wasn't human, but it wasn't completely animal either. It had this wide, flat structure with these prominent, heavy brow ridges that cast shadows over its eyes. The eyes themselves were large and dark, and when my high beams hit them, they reflected back with this eerie reddish glow, like a deer's eyes in headlights, but larger and somehow more aware. Its nose was wide and flat, almost ape-like, and I could see its breath creating these massive plumes of vapor in the freezing air. I couldn't make out much of a mouth, just a dark line beneath that nose, partially obscured by the hair. I'm not a small guy. I'm 6'1", and was about 210 pounds back then. But this thing dwarfed me. I'd estimate it stood between 7.5 to 8 feet tall, and it was broad, too, shoulders probably twice as wide as mine, with this massive barrel chest. Its arms were proportionally longer than a human's, thick and muscular-looking, even through all that hair. The hands were enormous. I could clearly see one of them held close to its chest, like it was protecting something, or maybe nursing an injury. The fingers looked thick and powerful, definitely capable of crushing something if they wanted to. The legs were just as impressive, long and powerful-looking, ending in these massive feet. I couldn't see the feet clearly because of the snow, but they had to be huge to support that frame. Here's the thing that really got to me. It didn't run away. It just stood there, perfectly still, staring directly at my headlights. Not moving an inch. Most animals would bolt if a vehicle approached, but this thing stood its ground, watching me. I sat there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 20-30 seconds, just staring at this creature. My knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel. I was terrified, but also completely fascinated. I'd heard stories about Sasquatch or Bigfoot my whole life. Everyone in Montana has. But I'd always thought they were bullshit. Just tales people made up to scare kids or explain away strange noises in the woods. But there it was, right in front of me, as real as anything I'd ever seen. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to throw the truck in reverse and get the hell out of there, but another part was worried about getting stuck in a snowbank if I tried to back up too fast on the slippery road. And honestly, a small part of me was curious. How many people ever get to see something like this? Eventually, I decided to try to drive around it. I slowly eased my truck forward, moving into the opposite lane to give the creature a wide berth. As I did, I rolled my window down just a crack, I don't even know why I did it, just instinct maybe, wanting to hear if it made any sounds. That's when the smell hit me. This powerful, musky odor, like wet dog mixed with something rotten and earthy. It was so strong it made my eyes water, even with just that tiny crack in the window. I quickly rolled it back up, but that smell lingered in the cab for hours afterward. As I slowly passed by, keeping my eyes on it the whole time, it turned its head to follow my movement but otherwise remained completely still. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I felt this intelligence in its gaze. Not human, but definitely not just animal either. There was something about the way it looked at me that sent a shiver down my spine, like it was assessing me, calculating. Once I was past it, I accelerated gradually, not wanting to make any sudden moves. I kept glancing in my rear-view mirror, watching as the figure grew smaller in the distance, still standing motionless in the pool of light cast by my taillights. After I'd gone maybe a quarter mile, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to drive to the next crossing, which I knew was about a half-mile ahead, turn around, and come back for another look. Maybe even try to take a picture with the disposable camera I kept in my glove compartment for insurance purposes. Looking back, it was probably stupid. This thing could have been dangerous, but I just couldn't help myself. So I drove to the crossing, turned around, and headed back, my heart racing the entire time. But when I reached the spot where I'd seen the creature, there was nothing there, just an empty road covered in fresh snow. I pulled over, grabbed my flashlight from under the seat, and actually got out of my truck to look around, which now seems insane to me. But I was running on adrenaline. The weirdest part, there were no tracks in the snow. None. Not a footprint, not a disturbance, nothing to indicate that this massive being had ever been standing there just minutes earlier. The snow was pristine and untouched, glistening under my flashlight beam. I searched for maybe 10 minutes, walking up and down that stretch of road, shining my light into the trees on either side, but found absolutely nothing. It was as if the creature had just vanished into thin air. Eventually, the cold drove me back into my truck. I sat there for a while, trying to process what I'd seen. Was I losing my mind? Had I hallucinated the whole thing? I was tired, sure, but not that tired. And I hadn't been drinking, hadn't had a drop of alcohol in days. I know what I saw was real. Every detail of it is burned into my memory. I finally drove home, arrived around 10 p.m. and tried to act normal when my wife asked about my day. I didn't mention what happened. Not then. I couldn't find the words. And honestly, I was afraid she'd think I was crazy. That night I barely slept. I kept seeing those eyes in my mind, that intelligent gaze, kept smelling that musky odor, kept replaying the whole encounter over and over, trying to make sense of it. The next day, I drove back to that same spot in the daylight. Still nothing, no tracks, no hair, no evidence at all that something that big had been standing there. I even reported what I'd seen to a local park ranger, who listened politely but obviously didn't believe me. Said they get Bigfoot reports every few years, especially during hunting season when people are tired and their eyes play tricks on them. But my eyes weren't playing tricks. What I saw was real. I've gone back to that stretch of road dozens of times over the years, hoping for another glimpse, but never seen anything unusual again. Almost 30 years have passed now. I've moved away from Montana, gotten divorced, changed careers, but that night has stayed with me. I still find myself looking more carefully into the trees when I'm driving on lonely roads at night. Still tense up when I catch an unusual smell in the woods. I've read books about Sasquatch, joined online forums, even attended a couple of conferences over the years. I've heard others describe encounters very similar to mine. Same height and build, same reddish eyeshine, same musky odor. It helps knowing I'm not alone in what I experienced, but I still can't explain how something that big could have disappeared without leaving tracks in the snow, or why it was just standing there in the middle of the road on such a bitter cold night, or what I saw in those eyes that seemed so knowing. All I know for certain is what I saw that night on County Road 72. Something that shouldn't exist according to science. Something that has no place in our understanding of the natural world. Something that has made me question everything I thought I knew about what's really out there in the dark. Story 9. I've debated for years whether to share this. Even now, typing this out makes my hands shake a little. I've told maybe 3 people in my life about what happened, and each time I got that look, you know the one. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. This happened in the fall of 1979. I was 24 and on leave from the Air Force, where I worked as a communications specialist. I had a pretty high security clearance due to the nature of my work. Nothing super dramatic, but enough that I was trusted with sensitive information. I mention this only because it becomes relevant later. I was staying at my parents' house in rural Indiana for a couple weeks. Not much had changed since high school. Same small town, same familiar faces at the diner. After a few days of catching up with family and old friends, I was getting restless. I've always been an early riser, military habit. And on this particular morning, I woke up around 5:30 a.m. with nothing planned for the day. It was one of those misty Indiana mornings where everything seems muffled and dreamlike. The kind of fog that hangs just above the ground, making the world look like it's floating. I decided to borrow my dad's Chevy and explore some of the back roads near the local college campus. My old man wouldn't be up for hours, and I left a note saying I'd taken the car. The car was this boxy tan Impala that smelled like my dad's pipe tobacco. I remember turning the radio on low, some country station playing Waylon Jennings, and just cruising with the windows cracked. The heater was fighting against the morning chill, and that familiar smell of fall was in the air. I drove aimlessly for maybe 45 minutes, just enjoying the quiet and the way the mist parted for the car. Eventually, I found myself on one of those unmarked county roads that wind behind the old churches and forgotten cemeteries. I remember noticing a "no hunting" sign that was half fallen over as I rounded a bend in the road. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, there was a large, dark shape bent over at the edge of the road. At first I thought it was a bear splashing in a puddle that had formed from the previous night's rain. We had black bears in the area, though they weren't common. So I slowed down, not wanting to startle it. As I got closer, maybe 30 feet away, I realized whatever this was, it wasn't a bear. It was much, much larger. I stopped the car and just sat there, engine idling. The thing hadn't noticed me yet, or if it had, it wasn't concerned. It was still hunched over, making these strange splashing motions in the puddle. I'm not sure what possessed me, but I put the car in park and opened the door slowly, using it as a shield between me and whatever this thing was. The door creaked, that distinctive sound old car doors make, and that's when it stopped moving. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, neither of us moved. Then slowly it began to stand up. I'll never forget this as long as I live. It unfurled itself from its crouched position like it was unfolding one section at a time, until it was standing completely upright. I'm 6'2", and this thing towered over what I'd consider tall. It had to be 8 or 9 feet minimum. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a suit. It was something else entirely. The thing was covered in dark, matted hair or fur, not black, but a deep dark brown, almost like old coffee grounds. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, maybe 3 feet across, with arms that hung down past where its knees should be. Its face was set forward in this pronounced way, not quite a snout, but definitely not human. The eyes were deep set under a heavy brow, and even from that distance I could tell they were intelligent. It just stood there, water dripping from its massive hands, staring at me. I remember being hit with this overwhelming smell, like wet dog mixed with something musky and sour. The air felt heavy, oppressive even. I don't know why, but my training kicked in. In the Air Force, they drill into you how to react under pressure. I slowly backed up, keeping the car door between us, and popped the trunk using the lever inside. Still facing the creature, I reached back and felt around until my hand closed around the shotgun my dad always kept there for hunting. It was his old Remington 870, nothing fancy, but reliable. I chambered a shell as quietly as I could, but in that morning stillness it sounded like a cannon. The creature tilted its head slightly at the sound, but otherwise didn't move. Here's where it gets weird. I pointed the shotgun in its general direction, not directly at it, but enough to make my point. I fired one shot to its left, the blast echoing through the trees. Then, after rechambering, I fired another to its right. Warning shots. That's what we were taught. Establish dominance without direct confrontation. The creature didn't even flinch. It just stood there, watching me with those eyes. No fear, no aggression, nothing. Just awareness. And then something happened that I've never been able to explain. I felt this presence in my mind. Not a voice, not even a thought exactly, but this overwhelming certainty that I couldn't hurt this thing even if I wanted to, and that if I tried, it would end badly for me. It wasn't threatening, it was just a fact, as real as gravity. The shotgun suddenly felt useless in my hands, like I was holding a toy. I lowered it slightly, not out of surrender, but acknowledgement. The creature seemed to understand. I swear to God, it raised its shoulders slightly in what looked for all the world like a shrug, this weirdly human gesture that seemed completely out of place on something so other. Then, without warning, it turned and leaped toward the tree line that bordered the road. Not ran, leaped. Each bound covered 15-20 feet, easy. It moved with this fluid grace that defied its size, like watching a freight train dance. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the woods, the only evidence of its passing being the swaying branches and disturbed underbrush. I stood there for I don't know how long, shotgun hanging limply at my side, just staring at the spot where it vanished. The whole encounter probably lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. Eventually, the cold brought me back to reality. My hands were numb, my breath fogging in front of me. I carefully put the shotgun back in the trunk, got in the car, and just sat there, trembling. Not from fear exactly, but from this massive adrenaline crash. I felt hollowed out, like something fundamental had shifted inside me. I drove to a gas station about 5 miles down the road and just sat in the parking lot for almost an hour, trying to process what I'd seen. The attendant kept giving me weird looks through the window, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Eventually, I gathered enough composure to drive to the county sheriff's office. I'm not sure what I expected, maybe validation, maybe help, maybe just someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. The office was this small brick building with a dispatch desk up front, manned by a woman who looked like she'd been working there since the Korean War. She took one look at me and asked if I was all right. I must have looked as shaken as I felt. I asked to speak to a deputy about something I'd seen, and she led me to a small interview room that smelled like stale coffee and cigarettes. After about 10 minutes, a deputy came in. Older guy, probably in his late 50s, with a salt and pepper mustache and the weathered look of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. I told him everything, trying to keep my voice steady and stick to the facts. The whole time he just listened, occasionally jotting something down in a small notebook. When I finished, he didn't laugh or dismiss me like I half expected. Instead, he sat back in his chair and sighed. "You're not the first," he said quietly, closing his notebook. "We've had 3 similar reports in the past 2 weeks. Couple of hunters up near Miller's Creek saw something matching your description. They're good men, not the type to make up stories." He asked for my details, name, contact info, what I was doing in town. When I mentioned I was on leave from the Air Force and my role as a communications specialist, his demeanor changed slightly. He asked about my security clearance, and I told him without thinking much of it. The deputy stood up and closed the door to the interview room, then sat back down. "Listen, son," he said, leaning forward. "I believe you saw something out there. But given your position and clearance level, I'd advise you to keep this to yourself. File it away as an unexplained experience and leave it at that." When I asked why, he just gave me this look that I still can't quite interpret. Part warning, part sympathy. "Some things are better left unreported officially. I'll make note of your sighting for our records, but if I were you, I wouldn't go sharing this story too widely." I left the sheriff's office more confused than when I went in. On the drive back to my parents' house, I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, the way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, that feeling in my head. It wasn't just a random animal, there was something more to it. When I got home, my dad asked where I'd been all morning. I told him I'd just gone for a drive to clear my head. He noticed the smell of gunpowder on my clothes and asked if I'd been shooting. I lied and said I'd stopped to help a farmer scare off some crows from his field. Dad didn't question it, but I could tell he knew something was off. I finished my leave without telling anyone else what happened. When I returned to base, I briefly considered reporting the incident through official channels, but remembered the deputy's advice. Whatever I saw that morning, it was clear some people already knew about it and preferred to keep it quiet. That was over 40 years ago now. I've since retired from the Air Force and moved out west. I've never seen anything like it again, despite spending plenty of time in remote areas. But I think about that morning often, the mist, the stillness, those eyes. Sometimes when I'm hiking alone, I'll get this prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like I'm being watched. I'll stop and scan the tree line, half expecting to see that massive shape standing there observing me. I've read all the stories about Bigfoot and Sasquatch over the years. Some match aspects of what I saw, others don't come close. I don't know what to call what I encountered that morning. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and for a brief moment we understood each other in some primal way that transcended language. Whatever it was, it let me see it, and then it let me go. I've never been able to explain the feeling I had, that I couldn't hurt it even if I tried. It wasn't fear or intimidation. It was like suddenly knowing an absolute truth. To this day, I can close my eyes and see it perfectly. Standing there in the mist, water dripping from its hands, regarding me with those ancient eyes before disappearing into the forest like it had never existed at all. Unsettling Story 10. Sasquatch. I've never been the type to buy into cryptid stories or urban legends. Growing up in Central Oregon, we'd sometimes hear about Bigfoot sightings, but I always thought it was just people seeing bears or letting their imagination run wild after too many beers. That was before last winter. Now, I don't know what to believe anymore. It all happened around February 2021. I live on a small property outside Redmond, Oregon. Maybe 15 minutes from Bend if you're driving fast. My parents have a bigger place about 3 miles north of me, and my younger sister lives in town. We're close to the Deschutes River, close enough that you can hear it on quiet nights when the wind is right. The first weird thing I heard was from Mike Henderson, a rancher who owns land about 5 miles from my place. Mike's not the type to make stuff up. He's a serious guy. Runs about 40 head of cattle, doesn't drink much, doesn't joke around. We were both at the feed store when he pulled me aside, looking uncomfortable. "You hear about anything strange around your property lately?" he asked, keeping his voice low. When I asked what he meant, he told me he'd seen something under his yard light at about 4 a.m. a few nights earlier. He'd gotten up to check on a pregnant heifer and glanced out his kitchen window. That's when he saw it. A dark figure standing perfectly still under the light. Said it had to be 7 feet tall at least, covered in dark hair, standing on 2 legs. When he flipped on his porch light for a better look, it turned and walked. Not ran, just calmly walked. Into the darkness. I'll admit I thought he was pulling my leg, but Mike looked genuinely shaken. He said he'd never believed in that Bigfoot nonsense either, but he couldn't explain what he saw. I might have forgotten about it, except 3 days later, my buddy Jason, who drives trucks between Bend and Portland, mentioned something similar. He was coming back late, around 2 a.m., when his headlights caught something crossing Highway 97. Said it was tall, hairy, and moved in a way that wasn't right. Not like a person in a costume, not like any animal he knew. It disappeared into the junipers before he could get a better look. That's when the memories of what my high school friend Tyler had told me a few weeks earlier came flooding back. Tyler's an avid fisherman and likes to camp along the Deschutes. He'd built this little makeshift shelter in the woods near the river last fall. Nothing fancy, just some branches and a tarp where he could store some gear. Said he went to check on it in January, and as he approached, something big erupted out of it. His word, not mine. He described it as about 7 feet tall, covered in dark hair, moving faster than any human could through the thick brush. Tyler's a hunter, knows every animal in these woods, and he swore this wasn't a bear or anything else he could identify. I started connecting these dots in my head, but I still wasn't convinced. Then my sister called me around midnight on February 18th. Her voice was shaking. "I just saw something on Old Bend Redmond Highway," she said. 2 somethings, actually. My sister Ashley is the last person to make up stories. She's a nurse, practical to a fault, and would sooner believe she's hallucinating than seeing something supernatural. She was driving home from a late shift at the hospital. It was one of those crystal-clear winter nights with a bright moon and a light dusting of snow on the ground. Perfect visibility. About halfway between Bend and Redmond, she spotted 2 figures walking alongside the road near a fence line. At first, she thought they were people, but as she got closer, she realized they were huge. One about 7 feet tall, the other maybe 6 feet. Both were covered in dark hair, had unusually long arms and short necks. Their heads seemed to sit directly on their shoulders. The crazy part, they weren't running or hiding. They were just walking calmly alongside the fence in an open field, seemingly unconcerned that her headlights were illuminating them. Ashley said she slowed down, not enough to stop. She wasn't that brave, but enough to get a good look. They never even turned to acknowledge her car. "They were real, Chris," she told me, using my name like she needed to make sure I was really listening. I don't know what they were, but they were real. And they weren't human. The next day, Ashley asked me to go with her to look at where she'd seen them. We drove out there in the afternoon. The fence ran alongside a field that looked ordinary enough from the road until we walked over to it. The path where she'd seen them walking was actually a thicket of dense, thorny bushes about 4 feet high. No human could have walked through there without getting torn to shreds, especially not at night. There were no broken branches, no trail, nothing to indicate anything had passed through there at all. But there were footprints in a few muddy patches, huge bare footprints, easily 16 inches long. They weren't clear enough to make out details, just depressions in the mud. They could have been anything, I told myself. A bear standing unusually, maybe some weird snowmelt pattern. I took photos on my phone, but they didn't really capture what we were seeing. That same night, and this is what really got to me, I was in my workshop behind my house. It was around 11 p.m., and I was finishing up some cabinet work for a client. My property backs up against a stretch of undeveloped land that runs all the way to the river, about a half-mile of junipers, sagebrush, and rocky outcroppings. I had the radio on low, just background noise really when I heard it. A sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was a howl, but not like a coyote or wolf, both of which I've heard plenty of times living out here. This was deeper, longer, almost mournful. It lasted maybe 5 to 10 seconds, rose and fell in pitch, and seemed to come from somewhere in the darkness beyond my property line. My 2 dogs, a German Shepherd and a blue Heeler mix, were outside. They're good watchdogs, bark at deer, coyotes, delivery trucks, pretty much anything. But when that sound came, they went dead silent. I went to the workshop door and called for them. Nothing. Eventually I found them huddled in the back corner of the barn, trembling. They refused to come out until morning. About 5 minutes after the first howl, there was another one, similar but slightly different in tone, like a response. Then silence. Complete silence. No crickets, no distant coyotes, nothing. Just the kind of unnatural quiet that feels heavy and wrong. I locked up the workshop and went inside, telling myself it was probably just some weird atmospheric thing making normal animal sounds distort. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I called my parents to ask if they'd heard anything strange. My dad answered, and before I could even bring it up, he said, "Did you hear those weird noises last night?" They'd heard the same sounds 3 miles away. My mom described them as like someone in pain, but not human. They'd lasted just long enough to be unsettling, then stopped. Their dogs had reacted the same way mine had, hiding, refusing to go outside. Over the next week I heard more stories. A couple hiking along the river spotted something large moving through the trees on the opposite bank. A woman driving home from work saw eyes reflecting her headlights from the tree line, eyes that were too high off the ground to be a deer or elk. A guy who lives near the old mill claimed something had raided his compost pile 3 nights in a row, leaving huge, strange footprints in the soft ground. Each story on its own could be dismissed. Misidentification, tricks of light and shadow, maybe even a prank. But together, all within the same 2-week period, all within about a 10-mile radius, that's harder to explain away. I started researching, diving into local forums and social media groups. Turns out there's been a history of similar sightings in Central Oregon going back decades. The Deschutes National Forest has had reports of unusual bipedal creatures since at least the 1970s. Most get ignored or ridiculed. Some get explained as bears with mange or moose that have wandered too far from their usual range. But the descriptions are consistent. Tall, hair-covered, walking upright, making sounds unlike any known wildlife. Then, about 2 weeks after Ashley's sighting, the report suddenly stopped. Whatever had been in our area seemed to move on. Life went back to normal, or as normal as it could be when I now found myself scanning the tree line every time I drove home after dark. I tried to rationalize it all. Maybe it was a weird coincidence of bear sightings. Maybe the stress of the pandemic had people on edge and seeing things. Maybe there was a simple explanation for all of it that I just couldn't see. But I can't explain what my sister saw walking calmly through a thorny thicket that would have shredded human skin. I can't explain why my dogs, who will chase after anything, hid in terror at those sounds. I can't explain the footprints, the multiple sightings by level-headed people I've known for years, all describing the same thing. I've lived in Central Oregon all my life. I know what bears look like, even when they're standing. I know what elk sound like during rutting season. I know the normal sounds and sights of these woods and hills. Whatever passed through our area last winter wasn't normal. I don't know if Sasquatch is the right word for it. I don't know what to call it at all. All I know is that something was here, something that wasn't supposed to exist, according to science and common sense. Now, when I'm in my workshop late at night and the wind carries sounds from the direction of the river, I find myself listening more carefully. When I drive along the highway after dark, I scan the fence lines and open fields with new awareness. When my dogs suddenly go alert, staring into the darkness beyond our property, I wonder what they're sensing that I can't. I've never told this story publicly before. Most people would think I'm crazy, or that I'm misinterpreting ordinary events. Maybe they're right, but I know what my sister saw, I know what I heard, and I know that for a few weeks in the winter of 2021, something strange was walking through the night in Central Oregon. The weirdest part? Sometimes I find myself hoping they'll come back just so I can know for sure I didn't imagine it all. Other times, when I'm alone on my property at night and that unnatural silence falls over everything, I pray they stay far, far away. Story 11. I've been debating whether to post this for months. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anyone of anything. I just need to get this off my chest because it's been eating at me since February, and maybe someone out there has seen something similar. This happened on February 18th, 2023. I live about 30 minutes outside of Juneau, Alaska. If you've never been here in winter, it gets dark early and stays dark late. We had just gotten about 10 inches of fresh powder the night before, and me and my buddies Mike and Jason decided to take our snowmobiles out. I know we shouldn't have been out there that late or in those specific trails. Some areas north of Juneau are off limits for snowmobiling, but we've been riding these back trails for years and never had any issues. Plus, with fresh snow, it's just too tempting. There's something about cutting through untouched powder that's just perfect. We met up at my place around 10:30 p.m. We had a couple beers, not enough to be impaired, just to take the edge off the cold, got our gear together and headed out around 11. The temperature was hovering around 15 degrees, but the sky was clear and there was a full moon, so visibility was actually pretty decent even without headlights. For the first hour or so, everything was normal. The three of us were taking turns leading, racing each other through open areas, and just generally having a good time. The snow was perfect, not too wet, not too powdery. Around midnight, we got to this area that's a bit more remote. There are some logging trails that branch off the main path, and we decided to explore one we hadn't been down before. I was in the lead at this point, with Mike and Jason hanging back about 50 yards. I remember checking my rear view to make sure they were still following, and I could see their headlights bouncing through the trees behind me. The trail opened up into this small clearing, maybe 40 feet across. The moonlight was hitting it just right, casting this blue-white glow across the untouched snow. That's when I noticed something odd. There were tracks crossing the clearing, but they weren't from another snowmobile. They weren't from a moose or deer either. They were different, wider than human footprints, but not round like a bear's. I slowed down and followed the tracks with my headlight. They led to a spot at the edge of the clearing where it looked like something had cleared away the snow and laid down. There was this depression in the snow, longer than a person would make, with swept areas around it like something had been moving around. I'm naturally curious, probably too much for my own good. Instead of waiting for Mike and Jason to catch up, I decided to follow the tracks. They led over this small rise, maybe 15 feet high. I throttled up and went over the top. As I came down the other side, my headlight hit something about 10-12 feet in front of me. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was the back of something big, something that shouldn't have been there. It was dark, covered in what looked like thick matted hair or fur. It was hunched over, doing something I couldn't see. The moment my light hit it, the thing stood up. That's when I realized how big it was. It had to be over 7 feet tall, maybe close to 8. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Shoulders too broad, arms too long. I froze. My brain was screaming at me to turn around, but my body wouldn't move. For what felt like forever but was probably less than a second, I just sat there, engine idling, staring at this thing's back. Then it turned. Not fully, just enough that I could see part of its profile. I couldn't make out its face in the shadows, but what I could see wasn't right. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. I've lived in Alaska my whole life. I know what bears look like, even in bad lighting. This wasn't that. In one fluid motion, it turned away from me and ran. And when I say ran, I mean it moved. There was this fallen log in front of it, covered in snow, probably about 4 feet high. This thing cleared it in a single bound, like it was nothing. The way it moved through the deep snow, it wasn't struggling or plowing through like a person would. It was almost like the snow wasn't even there. It disappeared into a thick stand of trees within seconds. My paralysis broke the moment it moved. I yanked my snowmobile around so hard I nearly tipped it. I gunned the engine and shot back over the rise, my heart feeling like it was going to explode out of my chest. I almost crashed into Mike and Jason as they were entering the clearing. I cut my engine and practically fell off my snowmobile, gasping for breath. They killed their engines too, asking what was wrong, if I'd seen a bear or crashed or something. I couldn't get the words out at first. My hands were shaking so bad, I had to shove them in my pockets. Finally, I managed to tell them what I'd seen. As I was talking, I kept looking back over the rise, terrified that thing was going to come bounding over it at any moment. Jason immediately started laughing, saying I'd probably just seen a moose or a bear and freaked myself out. Mike wasn't laughing, though. He was looking at my face, and I think he could tell how genuinely scared I was. "Let's go check it out," Jason said, reaching for his helmet. "No!" I practically shouted it. "We need to go, now!" Mike backed me up, saying if something had spooked me that bad, we should head back and come check it out in daylight. Jason thought we were being ridiculous, but agreed to leave when he saw I was serious about not staying. The ride back to my place was a blur. I kept imagining that thing following us through the trees, keeping pace with our snowmobiles. Every shadow looked like a massive, hair-covered figure. I've never ridden so fast on those trails, even with fresh powder. Back at my house, we shed our gear and I broke out the whiskey. I needed something stronger than beer. As the shock wore off, I tried to describe what I'd seen in more detail. "It wasn't a bear," I kept saying. "Bears are hibernating right now anyway." "Could have been a person," Jason suggested. "Maybe a hunter or another snowmobiler in dark gear?" But I knew it wasn't human. The height alone ruled that out. But more than that, the way it moved. No person could bound through deep snow like that, clearing a massive log with no apparent effort. And the build was all wrong, too broad, too powerful. "Bigfoot," Mike said, half joking, but I could tell he was trying to help me make sense of it. I've always rolled my eyes at Bigfoot stories. I'm not a believer in that stuff. Or I wasn't. But what else could it have been? I've hunted in Alaska my whole life. I know every animal that's supposed to be in these woods. This wasn't any of them. The more I drank, the more details I remembered. The way its breath had steamed in the cold air. The way the snow had barely compressed under its weight despite its size. The unnatural silence. No crashing through branches. No sound except for a soft whoosh as it cleared that log. Jason eventually got tired of my ghost story and crashed on my couch. Mike stayed up with me a bit longer, asking questions, genuinely trying to understand what I'd seen. But even he eventually suggested that maybe the shadows and moonlight had played tricks on my eyes. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing turning toward me. The partial glimpse of its profile burned into my memory. I kept wondering what it had been doing out there in the snow, hunched over like that. Had it been eating something? Digging? Just resting? The next day, Jason was still making jokes about my Bigfoot encounter, but Mike suggested we go back in daylight to look for tracks. Part of me wanted to prove I wasn't crazy. But a bigger part of me was terrified of going back there. What if it was still around? What if there were more of them? In the end, we didn't go. A storm moved in that afternoon, dumping another 8 inches of snow. Any tracks would have been covered. Maybe that was for the best. It's been months now, and I still think about it almost daily. I haven't been back to those trails. I sold my snowmobile in April, told everyone I was just trying to save money. But the truth is, I can't imagine going back into those woods, especially at night. Mike still asks me about it sometimes, but Jason has moved on to other things to tease me about. I've searched online for similar sightings in the area, but haven't found much. A few vague stories from hikers about feeling watched or hearing strange noises, but nothing as direct as what I experienced. I know how this sounds. If someone told me this story a year ago, I'd have nodded politely while thinking they were full of shit. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm still trying to make sense of it myself. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. It wasn't any animal native to Alaska that I'm familiar with. It moved with a purpose and intelligence that still chills me to think about. Sometimes I wonder if it recognized me as human, if it ran because it was a surprise to see me as I was to see it, or if it ran because it didn't want me to get a better look. The thought that keeps me up at night, though, is wondering what would have happened if I'd arrived just a minute earlier and caught it by surprise, or if I'd been alone out there with no friends waiting just over the ridge. If you're ever snowmobiling north of Juneau, stick to the main trails, stay with your group, and if you see unusual tracks crossing a moonlit clearing, turn around, don't follow them, don't do what I did. Whatever's making those tracks doesn't want to be found. I still haven't told my wife the full story. She knows something happened that spooked me bad enough to sell my sled, but I've downplayed it. How do you tell someone you love that everything they think they know about the world might be wrong? That there are things in the woods that aren't supposed to exist? All I know is that I'm never going back to those trails again. Not at night, not during the day. Some things are better left alone, in the dark, where they belong. Story 12. I never thought I'd be posting about something like this. I actually made an account just to share this because, honestly, it's been eating at me for the past year and a half. I've always been the guy who rolls his eyes when people talk about paranormal stuff or cryptids. But something happened to me in October 2021 that I can't explain, and I can't stop thinking about it. I'm a long-haul trucker, been doing it for about 15 years now. I've seen some weird stuff on the road, accidents, strange weather phenomena, you name it. But nothing like what I saw that evening on I-90 just west of Spokane. It was around dusk, that weird time when it's not quite dark enough for headlights, but the lights fading fast. I was heading east, my rig loaded with machinery parts bound for Montana. Traffic was light that evening, which was nice after dealing with Seattle's mess earlier that day. I remember I had just adjusted my seat and was sipping on a lukewarm coffee when I noticed movement ahead. About a quarter mile up the highway, 3 deer were sprinting across the road from north to south. And I mean sprinting. I've seen plenty of deer on highways. Usually they kind of prance or trot across. These ones were in full panic mode, like something was after them. My first thought was, shit, I hope they clear out before I get there. I hit the engine brake to start slowing down, which is standard procedure when you see animals on the road. My truck was running about 65 mph at the time, and those Jake brakes make a hell of a noise, but I wanted to be cautious. That's when I saw it. Behind the deer, maybe 75 yards back, something was following them. At first, I thought it was just another deer, but no, this thing was walking on 2 legs. It was leaning forward as it moved, almost like it was hunched over, but it was moving fast, like unnaturally fast for something walking upright. I blinked hard, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me from driving all day. But when I looked again, it was still there. This thing crossed from the median into the eastbound lane in like 5 or 6 strides. Each stride had to be at least 6 feet long, probably more. It cleared the whole damn highway in seconds. By now I'd slowed to about 40 minutes, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. My heart was hammering in my chest. As I reached the spot where the creature had crossed, I could see it standing in the trees on the right side of the road, maybe 75 feet in. It wasn't hiding, it was just standing there, kind of half-turned, like it was watching both me and those deer that were still running for their lives. The thing was massive, covered in this dark chocolate-brown fur that looked matted and uneven, almost like it was dirty or wet in patches. Its face, though, that's what gets me when I try to sleep sometimes. The face had bare skin, a bit lighter than the fur, kind of a lighter brown. It had these deep wrinkles, reminded me of my grandfather's face, old-looking but not human. And I couldn't see a neck. It was like the head just sat on these enormous shoulders. Based on my truck's height and the trees around it, I'd put this thing at between 8.5 to 9 feet tall, minimum. My cab sits pretty high, and this thing could have looked right in at me if it had been next to the truck. The whole encounter lasted maybe 10-15 seconds, but it felt like time slowed down. I remember this weird silence in my cab, even with the engine running. I couldn't hear my radio anymore, couldn't hear anything except my own breathing and heartbeat. Then it just turned away and moved deeper into the trees, not running, just this purposeful walk, still tracking those deer, I guess. Within seconds, I couldn't see it anymore through the trees. I didn't stop. No way in hell was I stopping. I got the truck back up to speed and kept driving for another hour before I pulled into a rest area. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely text my wife to tell her I was taking a break. I didn't tell her why. How could I? "Hey, honey, just saw Bigfoot chasing some deer across I-90? "Yeah, right." The thing is, I've always been the skeptical one. Whenever we'd go camping and hear weird noises at night, I'd joke, "Must be Bigfoot," and laugh it off. I've driven through pretty much every wilderness area in the Northwest over the years, and I never believed in any of that stuff. I figured people were seeing bears standing up or their minds were playing tricks on them in the dark. But this wasn't dark. I saw this thing clearly, and it wasn't a bear. Bears don't move like that. They don't have that kind of stride length or speed when walking upright. They don't have faces like that. After sitting in that rest area for about an hour, collecting myself, I continued on to my delivery point. That night at the motel, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying it in my head. I even sketched what I saw on the hotel notepad, though I'm no artist. The next morning, I started researching. Turns out, that area near the Spokane River has had similar reports over the years. I found online forums where other drivers and hunters described seeing similar things. Before my experience, I would have dismissed them all as attention seekers or people who'd had too much to drink. Now, I don't know what to think. I considered reporting it to someone, but who? The police? "Excuse me, officer, I'd like to report a Sasquatch sighting." They'd laugh me out of the station, and I wouldn't blame them. I'd have done the same a year ago. For a while, I avoided taking jobs that would send me on that stretch of I-90. I'd make excuses, say I wanted routes further south. My dispatcher probably thought I was being picky, but eventually I had to take a job that way again. Every time I pass that spot now, during daylight hours only if I can help it, I slow down a little and scan the tree line. I haven't seen anything since, and part of me hopes I never do. What bothers me most is that I can't explain it away. I was well rested, completely sober, and it wasn't even fully dark yet. I saw what I saw, and whatever it wasn't something that's supposed to exist, according to science. A few weeks after it happened, I broke down and told my buddy Mike, another trucker. He listened without interrupting, which I appreciated, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He didn't call me crazy to my face, but he's been different around me since then. Makes these little jokes sometimes, like, "Seen any monsters lately?" when we meet up at truck stops. It stings. But I get it. I wouldn't have believed me either. My wife noticed something was off too. I started checking the locks more carefully at home, keeping the blinds closed at night. I even bought a higher-powered flashlight for when I take the dog out in the evening. I told her I had a close call with a big animal on the road, and it spooked me, which isn't entirely a lie. She thinks I'm just being more safety conscious after a scare, and I've let her believe that. The thing is, whatever I saw that day wasn't aggressive toward me. It could have easily approached my truck if it wanted to, but it didn't. It was focused on those deer. I sometimes wonder if I just happened to witness some predator-prey interaction that most people never get to see. Like maybe these things are out there, but they're rare, and they avoid humans when they can. But other times, especially at night, when I'm on a dark stretch of highway, I wonder what would have happened if I'd broken down in that area, if my truck had stalled just as that thing was crossing the road. Would it have ignored me like it did? Or would I have been as interesting as those deer? I've driven that route dozens of times since then. Sometimes I take a passenger with me, another driver in training, or my nephew who's interested in trucking. I never tell them what I'm looking for, but I always watch that stretch of road more carefully, especially around dusk. Last month I picked up a hitchhiker near Coeur d'Alene, something I rarely do these days for safety reasons, but the guy looked harmless enough, older gentleman with fishing gear. As we were driving through that area, he got real quiet, staring out the window. Then he asked me, completely out of nowhere, if I'd ever seen anything strange on this stretch. My blood ran cold. I played dumb, asked him what he meant. He just shrugged and said he'd heard stories from other drivers, that's all. We didn't talk much after that. Sometimes I think about reporting it to one of those cryptozoology groups, but then I see how they sensationalize everything, and I hold back. I'm not looking to be featured on some cable TV show or have my name associated with something most people would mock. I've worked hard to build my reputation as a reliable, level-headed driver. The last thing I need is to be known as that Bigfoot trucker guy. But then again, what if what I saw is something science should know about? What if it's some undiscovered species that's managed to avoid documentation? Don't researchers need to know about these sightings to establish patterns? I go back and forth on this all the time. I've started keeping a small camera on my dashboard now. Probably too little too late, but if I ever see anything like that again, I want proof. Not just for others, for myself too. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember those eyes, that face, the way it moved, and I know what I saw was real. It's been about 1.5 years now since that day. I still drive that route regularly, though I try to time it so I'm not going through that area at dusk. I still scan the tree line every time. I still think about those deer running for their lives, and that thing pursuing them with those massive strides. I still don't have answers. I just know that the world is bigger and stranger than I ever gave it credit for. And sometimes, when you're alone on the highway at dusk, you might just catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist. And then what do you do with that knowledge? I still haven't figured that part out. Story 13. I've been trying to make sense of what happened for 2 weeks now, but I still can't wrap my head around it. I'm not crazy or looking for attention. I just need to tell someone what happened because it's eating me up inside, and Mark and I can barely talk about it with each other. It was April 23rd, a Tuesday, when Mark and I headed out to go mushroom hunting near the Skagit River. We live in Burlington, about 20 minutes from Concrete, and we've been foraging that area for 3 years now. Nothing weird had ever happened before. The weather forecast was perfect, mid-50s with partial clouds, and we'd had a decent amount of rain the previous week, which is ideal for morels. We'd been planning this trip for over a month. Morel season is short around here, and we needed a good haul to make some extra cash at the Mount Vernon Farmers Market on Saturday. Our booth did pretty well last year, and we were hoping to do even better this time. We got to our spot around 7:30 in the morning. It's this little unmarked pull-off about 2 miles past the ranger station, where you can park right off the Forest Service Road. We've always had good luck there, especially on the sloped areas that face east, near stands of old cottonwoods and dying firs. The forest was quiet when we arrived, that peaceful morning quiet where you just hear birds and the distant sound of the river. We packed our gear, mesh bags for the mushrooms. Never use plastic bags for morels, they'll get soggy. Our knives, water bottles, and some trail mix. Mark brought his walking stick because parts of the terrain can be pretty uneven. We decided to split up to cover more ground. It made sense at the time. Morels can be hard to spot, and we wanted to maximize our chances. Mark headed northwest along a familiar trail that follows an old logging road before cutting into the forest. I took the path that winds down closer to the river. We agreed to meet back at the truck at noon for lunch and then continue for a few more hours after. The first hour went great. I found a small patch of early morels, about 8 of them, near a fallen cottonwood. They weren't huge, but they were definitely market quality. I carefully cut them at the base with my knife and placed them in my bag. The forest smelled amazing, that earthy, damp scent mixed with pine and decomposing leaves. But then I started noticing something odd. As I moved deeper into my usual hunting grounds, I kept finding freshly cut mushroom stems. Someone had clearly been there very recently, maybe even that morning, harvesting the same spots we typically hit. This was frustrating but not totally unexpected. Good foraging spots sometimes get discovered by others, and it's just part of the game. What was weird, though, was the pattern. Whoever had been there before me hadn't taken everything. They'd left behind some perfectly good morels, which isn't something an experienced forager would typically do. And the stems were cut in a strange way, not with a clean knife slice, but almost like they'd been pinched or twisted off. After about 2 hours, I'd only collected maybe a pound of morels, nowhere near what we needed for the market. I decided to push further into the woods, heading toward an area we rarely visit because it's more difficult to navigate. There's a steep ravine that drops down about 30 feet before leveling out near a marshy area. It's a pain to climb back up, but I thought it might be worth checking. Making my way down carefully, I noticed the area seemed untouched by other foragers. No cut stems, no footprints in the soft ground. This was promising. I spent about 45 minutes scanning the forest floor and found a decent patch of morels near the base of a cluster of young fir trees. As I was kneeling to harvest them, I had this sudden feeling. You know that sensation when you just know someone's watching you? It was like that, but much more intense. The hair on my arms stood up. I slowly looked around, trying to figure out what had triggered that feeling. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the typical forest scenery. But then I heard it, breathing, heavy, rhythmic breathing that definitely wasn't mine. It wasn't like an animal panting. It was deeper, more controlled, almost like someone trying to breathe quietly, but not quite managing it. My first thought was that another forager had followed me to my spot, which would have been annoying but not scary. I stood up and called out, "Hello, is someone there?" No response, just that same breathing, which seemed to pause briefly when I spoke. That's when I spotted the morel. It was a perfect specimen, probably 4 inches tall, growing right at the base of a large Douglas fir, about 15 feet to my right. I stepped toward it, still feeling uneasy but trying to ignore it. As I bent down to cut the mushroom, something made me look up. Standing about 50 feet away, partially obscured by a cluster of trees, was something. At first, my brain tried to process it as a person in dark clothes, maybe wearing some kind of costume or gear. But within seconds, I realized this wasn't a person. Not at all. It was massive. I'm 5'7", and this thing had to be at least 7.5 feet tall. Its body was covered in thick, matted hair, mostly dark brown, but with patches that looked almost black. The build was powerful, with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad and arms that hung down much lower than a human's would, almost to its knees. The face is what haunts me the most now. It was partially hidden by the hair, but I could clearly see a prominent brow ridge that shadowed its eyes. The nose was wide and flat, and below it I could make out what looked like a mouth set in a grim line. But it was the eyes that paralyzed me with fear, dark and deeply set. They were fixed directly on me with an intensity that felt intelligent. This wasn't an animal looking at me with simple curiosity or hunger. There was something calculating in that gaze. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Stay perfectly still? Try to appear threatening? My mind was racing through every nature documentary and wildlife encounter advice I'd ever heard, but none of it seemed applicable to whatever this was. I broke eye contact for just a moment, glancing in the direction where I thought Mark might be, desperately hoping he would appear. When I looked back, the creature had moved, not away, but behind a large fir tree about 40 feet from me. It wasn't completely hidden, though. I could still see part of its shoulder and one arm, as if it was purposely letting me know it was still there. That's when I screamed, not a strategic decision, just pure instinct taking over. I screamed Mark's name as loud as I could and started running back the way I'd come, dropping my bag of mushrooms in the process. I stumbled and nearly fell several times as I scrambled up the ravine, branches whipping at my face and arms. I heard Mark calling my name before I saw him. He was running toward me from the direction of the truck, looking panicked. When we reached each other, I was hyperventilating and could barely speak. He grabbed my shoulders, asking what happened, if I was hurt. Between gasps, I managed to tell him we needed to leave right now. He looked confused, but must have seen the genuine terror in my eyes because he didn't argue. As we hurried back toward the truck, Mark told me something that made my blood run cold. For the past half hour or so, he'd been hearing something following him in the woods, heavy footsteps that would stop when he stopped, and strange sounds he described as soft, guttural chattering. He'd thought it was me at first, playing some kind of joke, but the sounds never got closer when he called out. We reached the truck in record time. Mark fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before managing to unlock the doors. As we got in, I kept looking back at the forest edge, half expecting to see that figure emerge from the trees. Mark started the engine, and we peeled out of there so fast we left a cloud of dust on the service road. Once we were on the main highway heading back toward Burlington, Mark asked me to explain exactly what I'd seen. I told him everything, trying to be as precise as possible, even though my voice was shaking. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "I think we both know what that was, Lisa." Neither of us wanted to say the word out loud. It sounds ridiculous, like something from a cheesy TV show or a tourist trap. But we've lived in Washington State our whole lives, and we've heard the stories. Everyone around here has. When we got home, I immediately jumped in the shower, scrubbing my skin until it was red, trying to wash away the feeling of those eyes on me. Mark looked up news reports and online forums for similar sightings in the area. He found several from over the years, including a couple from just this past March near the same general area. It's been 2 weeks now, and we still haven't told many people. Mark's brother laughed it off when we tried, and I know my parents would just worry. We did report it anonymously to one of those tracking websites for these kinds of encounters, but I don't know if anything will come of it. We haven't gone back to that spot, obviously. We even skipped the farmer's market last weekend. I'm not sure when, or if, we'll ever go foraging again, which breaks my heart, because it's been such a big part of our lives. The worst part is the dreams. Almost every night I see those eyes staring at me from the trees. Sometimes I'm back in that ravine, but the figure is closer, close enough that I can smell a musky, earthy odor. Sometimes it's outside our bedroom window, just watching. I wake up drenched in sweat, convinced it followed us home somehow. Mark says I should talk to someone professional about it, and maybe he's right. But what would I say? That I'm traumatized after seeing something that most people don't believe exists? I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear standing upright. It wasn't a person in a suit. The way it moved, the intelligence in those eyes. This was something else. Something that shouldn't exist but does, hiding in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, watching us when we think we're alone. I can't explain why it didn't approach me, or why it seemed to be following both of us separately. Was it curious, territorial, hunting? These questions keep me up at night. All I know is that I'll never look at the woods the same way again. That feeling of peace and solitude I used to find among the trees is gone now, replaced by a constant sense of being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves, every shadow that seems a little too dark or a little too tall, they all bring me right back to that moment, staring into the eyes of something that has probably been there all along, watching us from the shadows while we remained oblivious. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm not even sure I want to believe it myself. But I needed to tell someone to get this experience out of my head where it's been replaying on an endless loop. The logical part of my brain keeps trying to find alternative explanations. Maybe it was just a very tall person with an unusual appearance who happened to be in the woods at the same time. Maybe the stress of needing to find enough mushrooms for the market caused me to misinterpret what I saw. Maybe I've watched too many documentaries about Pacific Northwest folklore. But then I remember those eyes, and the way Mark described the chattering sounds following him, and I know what we experienced was real. Whatever was in those woods that day wasn't human, and it wasn't any normal animal either. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, waiting for us to return, or if it's moved on to follow other unsuspecting hikers and foragers. I wonder if it's watching someone right now, standing just at the edge of their peripheral vision, breathing that heavy, rhythmic breath that I still hear sometimes when our house gets too quiet. I don't have any evidence. No photos, no footprints, nothing but my account and Mark's story about what he heard. I know that's not enough for most people, but if you're planning to go mushroom hunting near the Skagit River anytime soon, maybe reconsider, or at the very least, don't split up. And if you feel like you're being watched, if you hear breathing that isn't yours or chattering that sounds almost but not quite human, get out of there as fast as you can. Because now I know we're not always alone in the woods. Sometimes there are eyes watching from the shadows. Sometimes there are things moving just out of sight. And sometimes, if you're as unlucky as I was, you might actually see what's been watching you all along. Story 14. I've been debating whether to post this for a long time. What happened that day in 2017 has stuck with me for years, and I still get chills thinking about it. I've never been the type to believe in cryptids or monsters, but what my uncle and I saw that day in the New Hampshire wilderness completely changed my perspective on what might be out there. I was 15 at the time, and my Uncle Ben, who was around 40, had invited me on what was supposed to be a simple fishing trip. We both loved fishing for speckled trout, and northern New Hampshire has some amazing spots tucked away in the forests where most tourists don't venture. Uncle Ben knew all the best spots from years of exploring those woods. We headed out super early on a Saturday morning in early June. The weather was perfect, not too hot yet, with that early summer freshness in the air. We drove about an hour from my uncle's place to reach this remote trailhead on an old logging road. The plan was to hike about 5 miles to this stream my uncle swore was teeming with trout like you wouldn't believe. Uncle Ben parked his truck at the end of this rough dirt road. I remember the path ahead didn't look like much, just a narrow trail disappearing into thick woods. We grabbed our fishing gear, some sandwiches my aunt had made, and our water bottles. Uncle Ben also brought his hunting knife and a small first aid kit. He was always prepared like that. The hike-in was beautiful. The forest was dense with pine trees, and occasional clearings gave us glimpses of the distant mountains. Uncle Ben pointed out different plants and animal tracks as we walked. He'd grown up in these woods and knew them like the back of his hand. We saw deer tracks, some porcupine quills, and even spotted a red fox darting through the underbrush at one point. About 2 hours into our hike, we came across something that, looking back now, was probably our first warning sign. Just off the trail, we found the partially eaten remains of a snowshoe hare. It was fresh, couldn't have been dead for more than a couple hours. The way it was torn apart didn't look like the work of a fox or coyote. The wounds were larger, and there were chunks missing that suggested something with bigger jaws had been feeding on it. Probably a bobcat, Uncle Ben said, though he looked around carefully before we moved on. I noticed he seemed a bit more alert after that, occasionally glancing back over his shoulder. When we finally reached the stream, it was everything Uncle Ben had promised. Crystal clear water bubbling over rocks, deep pools where you could see trout swimming. We immediately set up our gear and started fishing. I remember the excitement I felt when I caught my first trout within minutes of casting my line. Uncle Ben laughed and said I had the magic touch that day. As we moved upstream, we came to this one spot where the water was unusually disturbed. The normally clear water was cloudy, and there were wet marks on some of the rocks near the bank, as if something large had recently been in the stream. Uncle Ben studied the area with a frown. Something was just here, he said quietly. Something big. I assumed he meant a deer or maybe a moose, which aren't uncommon in that area. We kept fishing, and by early afternoon, we'd caught our limit of trout. Uncle Ben cleaned them by the stream and wrapped them carefully to take home. I was already imagining how good they'd taste for dinner. The strange thing is, as successful as our fishing had been, the woods felt different on our way back, quieter. The usual bird calls had diminished, and even the wind seemed to have died down. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was tired from fishing and looking forward to getting back to the truck. But Uncle Ben, I noticed he kept scanning the trees around us, occasionally stopping to listen. About halfway back, we came upon this old abandoned cabin. It wasn't much, just a small one-room structure with a collapsed corner and moss growing up the sides. Uncle Ben said it was an old Forest Service cabin that hadn't been used in decades. We decided to take a short break there and eat our sandwiches. Inside the cabin, there was an old metal desk with rusty drawers and a broken chair. What caught my attention was a logbook sitting on the desk, protected from the elements by the relatively intact roof. Curious, I opened it while munching on my sandwich. Most of the entries were faded and dated from the 1980s and early 1990s, just rangers noting maintenance or hikers signing in. But as I flipped through, I noticed several entries that mentioned something called the Mountain Walker. One entry from August 1992 read, "Heard the Mountain Walker again last night, third time this month, getting closer to the cabin each time." Another from September 1994, "Found enormous tracks by the East Creek. The Mountain Walker is real. No bear makes tracks like these." I showed the book to Uncle Ben, who read through a few entries with a serious expression. He closed the book and put it back without saying much, just that people in isolated places often created stories to explain natural phenomena. But I could tell the entries had made him uneasy. He suggested we get moving to reach the truck before dark. We'd been walking for maybe another hour when it happened. The trail had widened slightly, opening to a small clearing ahead with dense forest on either side. Uncle Ben, who was walking a few steps ahead of me, suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. The way he froze, it wasn't like he was just pausing to rest or check directions. His whole body went rigid. I nearly bumped into him. "What's up?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He was staring into a small clearing about 30 yards ahead, completely motionless. I tried to see what he was looking at, but from my angle behind him, I couldn't make out anything unusual, just trees and undergrowth. For what felt like forever, probably 15 or 20 seconds in reality, Uncle Ben just stood there, not moving a muscle, not even seeming to breathe. Then, without any explanation, he suddenly reached back, grabbed my arm and said in a low, tense voice, "We need to go. Now." Before I could ask questions, he was pulling me back the way we had come, moving at a pace just short of running. I stumbled along behind him, completely confused. "Uncle Ben, what's going on? What did you see?" I kept asking, but he just shook his head and kept moving, occasionally glancing back over his shoulder. "Just keep moving, Danny. Don't stop." We didn't go back to the trail we'd been on. Instead, Uncle Ben cut through the forest on a different route, moving surprisingly fast for a man his age. I was struggling to keep up, branches whipping at my face as we practically ran through the woods. My heart was pounding, not just from the exertion, but from the fear that was starting to build. Whatever had spooked my uncle, a man who'd spent his entire life in these woods and wasn't afraid of bears or moose, must have been something serious. We kept up this pace for what felt like an eternity. My legs were burning and I was gasping for breath, but Uncle Ben wouldn't slow down. It was like he was possessed by some primal fear I couldn't understand. Finally, after what must have been at least an hour of this grueling pace, we emerged onto the logging road about a quarter mile from where we'd parked the truck. Only when we reached the vehicle did Uncle Ben finally slow down. He unlocked the doors with shaking hands and practically shoved me inside before jumping in himself and locking the doors. He started the engine immediately, but just sat there for a moment, breathing hard, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I was completely bewildered and by this point pretty scared. "Uncle Ben, what the hell? What did you see back there?" He took a deep breath and finally turned to look at me. His face was pale, and there was a look in his eyes I'd never seen before, a mixture of disbelief and lingering fear. "I didn't want to scare you while we were still in the woods," he said, his voice unusually quiet. "But I saw something back there, something I've heard stories about my whole life, but never believed was real." My mind raced with possibilities. A bear, a mountain lion, maybe even an armed person. But what he said next made my blood run cold. "I saw a Sasquatch, Danny, clear as day." At first I thought he was joking, trying to lighten the mood after our frantic escape. But the look on his face told me he was dead serious. "It was at least 8 feet tall, probably over 500 pounds, he continued, staring through the windshield as if he could still see it. It had one long arm holding onto a tree, and one foot was propped on the slope of the forest floor. It was just watching us." I sat there in stunned silence as Uncle Ben described what he'd seen in more detail. The creature had been covered in dark brown, almost black hair. Its face was surprisingly flat, with deep-set eyes that he described as too aware, too intelligent for an animal. What struck him most was how it had just stood there, observing us with what seemed like curiosity rather than aggression. It watched us for 15 or 20 seconds before it just lost interest. Then it turned and moved into the woods. Uncle Ben shook his head in disbelief. "The thing that gets me is how silent it was. Something that big should make noise moving through brush, but there was nothing, not a sound." As Uncle Ben finally put the truck in gear and started driving away, I found myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see this creature emerge from the forest. But there was nothing, just the usual wall of pines and maples. We drove in silence for a while before Uncle Ben spoke again. "I didn't tell you what I saw right away because I didn't want to scare you while we were still out there. I just wanted to get us back to the truck as fast as possible." As the initial shock wore off, we started piecing things together. The partially eaten hare we'd found, the disturbed water in the stream. It all made a strange kind of sense now. Uncle Ben figured we must have startled it while it was eating, and it had followed us out of curiosity. That's when I remembered something else. During our stop on the trail, right before Uncle Ben had frozen in place, I detected a faint but distinct odor. It was musky, almost like wet dog, but stronger and wilder. At the time, I'd assumed it was from the nearby swamp, but now I wasn't so sure. "Did you smell anything weird back there?" I asked Uncle Ben. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's another thing. There was this smell. Hard to describe, not like any animal I know." The drive home was surreal. We tried to process what had happened, alternating between long silences and frantic discussions about what Uncle Ben had seen. Part of me still wondered if maybe he'd seen a bear standing on its hind legs or some other explainable animal. But Uncle Ben was adamant. He'd been a hunter all his life and knew every animal in those woods. This was something different. "I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes," he kept saying. "But I know what I saw, Danny, and it wasn't a bear or a moose or anything else I've ever encountered." When we got back to his house, Uncle Ben made me promise not to tell anyone about what had happened. Not my parents, not my friends, no one. "People will think we're crazy," he said. "Or worse, they'll go looking for it. That thing deserves to be left alone." I kept that promise for years. Sometimes I'd bring it up with Uncle Ben when we were alone, and he'd talk about it a little, but mostly he seemed to want to put it behind him. He never went back to that specific fishing spot again, though he still hunts and fishes all over New Hampshire. It's been 6 years now, and I still don't know what to make of what happened that day. I never actually saw the creature myself, but I trust my uncle completely. He's the most level-headed, practical person I know. If he says he saw a Sasquatch, then that's what he saw. Sometimes I dream about it, about what would have happened if we'd stayed a little longer, if I'd seen it too. Would it have approached us, attacked us, or just continued watching with that eerie intelligence Uncle Ben described? I don't have answers. All I know is that there's something out there in the woods of northern New Hampshire that defies explanation. Something huge that moves without sound through dense forest. Something that most people believe is just a legend, but it's real. And sometimes, when I'm hiking or camping and the forest goes suddenly quiet, I can't help but wonder if the mountain walker is nearby, watching from just beyond the trees, curious about the humans who've wandered into its territory. Story 15. I've been sitting on this for over a year now. It happened in September 2022, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. My wife and I were taking this coastal road trip from Seattle down to San Francisco, something we'd been planning for a while. She's always wanted to see the redwoods, and with my job as a long-haul trucker, I'm usually the one seeing all these amazing places while she's back home. We spent a few days in Seattle first, Pike Place Market, the Space Needle, all that tourist stuff. Then we picked up our rental, just a basic sedan, nothing fancy. I remember joking with the guy at the counter about how it felt tiny compared to my rig. We packed our stuff and hit Highway 101 south. The plan was to take it slow, enjoy the scenery, stop at little towns along the way. Our first night, we made it to Brookings, Oregon. Found this older motel right by the harbor. Not luxury or anything, but the view was incredible. We could see all these fishing boats bobbing in the water from our window. That night, we had seafood at some local place, walked around a bit, then crashed early. I'm used to driving before dawn. Trucker habits die hard. My wife isn't a morning person at all, so when I woke up around 4:30 a.m., I figured I'd let her sleep in the car while I got us a head start. The motel coffee was barely drinkable, but I grabbed a cup anyway, and we were on the road by 5. She was out cold in the passenger seat, wrapped in this blue blanket she always brings on trips, head leaning against the window. The morning was foggy, that heavy coastal fog that makes everything look surreal. Traffic was non-existent, just me and the road. I had the heat on low and the radio turned down to some classical station that was coming in and out with the mountains. Maybe 30 minutes into the drive, the road curved right along the coastline, and I noticed this small beach off to the side. What caught my eye was the sand. Even in the dim light, I could tell it was unusually dark, almost black. There was this small paved pull-off area, probably meant for sightseeing during the day. On impulse, I decided to stop. Thought maybe I'd take a quick picture of the sunrise over this beach, wake my wife if the view was worth it. I pulled over, killed the engine but left the headlights on. They cut through the fog and lit up parts of the beach. I was about to reach over and wake my wife when something moved at the edge of the headlight beams. At first, I thought it was just fog shifting or maybe a large piece of driftwood I was misinterpreting in the bad light. But then it moved again, and I froze. There was something, standing directly in front of our car, maybe 20 feet away where the pavement met the sand. I remember my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. This figure was massive. I'm 6'1", and this thing towered over what I'd guess as my height. Had to be at least 6'7", maybe 7 feet tall. And it wasn't just tall, it was broad, powerful looking, the kind of frame that makes you instantly aware of how fragile you are in comparison. It was covered in this thick, matted fur or hair. Dark brown, but in the shadows, and with just my headlights it looked nearly black in places. The fur seemed longer in some areas, particularly hanging from the arms and around what I'd call the shoulders. I couldn't make out all of its face, thank God, because it was partially hidden by all that hair. But what I could see, I still have trouble sleeping sometimes thinking about it. There was this prominent brow ridge protruding over deep-set eyes. The nose was wide and flat, nothing like a human nose, and those eyes, they locked onto mine through the windshield. I know it saw me. I know it recognized me as a person, as something that didn't belong there. The strangest detail, it was holding something. Took me a second to realize it was a clump of seaweed, and it was examining it almost like it was looking for something in it. Maybe food, I don't know. But what really shook me was its reaction. It wasn't startled by our car or the headlights. It seemed angry, territorial, like I had interrupted its breakfast or invaded its space. I sat there paralyzed for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. My wife was still asleep somehow, her breathing steady. I was terrified to move, to do anything that might provoke whatever was standing in front of us. Then it made this sound, a loud, guttural snort that I felt more than heard, like a warning. I swear I could see vapor from its breath in the cold morning air. What happened next is burned into my memory. It turned deliberately, never breaking eye contact with me, and began crossing the highway. Its stride was so powerful, so purposeful, not running, not scared, just methodically moving while staring me down the entire time. The way it walked was all wrong, fluid, but with this strange rolling gait that no human has. Just as it reached the other side of the highway, another vehicle appeared around the bend, a pickup truck heading north. Its headlights swept across the creature, illuminating it fully for a split second. I saw the driver's face through his windshield, pure shock, mouth hanging open. He hit his brakes hard, the truck fishtailing a little. The creature disappeared into the tree line on the other side of the road, just gone. The dense forest there swallowed it completely. I was shaking so badly I could barely get the key back in the ignition. I remember looking over at my wife, still somehow asleep through all of this, and feeling this bizarre mix of relief and isolation. I cranked the engine and pulled back onto the highway, driving way too fast. All I wanted was distance between us and that place. About a mile down the road, I noticed the pickup truck from earlier pulled over on the shoulder. The driver was standing outside, waving his arms frantically for me to stop. Every instinct told me to keep driving, but I needed validation. I needed someone else to confirm what I'd seen. I pulled over a little ahead of him and rolled down my window. He jogged up, middle-aged guy, maybe in his 50s, wearing a flannel jacket and baseball cap. Local, from the looks of him. "Did you see that?" were his first words, voice shaking. "Back there, did you fucking see that?" I nodded, still unable to form proper sentences. "What the hell was it?" he asked, looking back over his shoulder like it might have followed us. I don't know," I managed to say. "Been driving this road for 20 years, he said. "Never seen anything like... Jesus Christ, it was looking right at us." We stood there comparing notes in hushed, frantic tones. He thought it was at least 7 feet tall. Said he'd seen bears and elk and all kinds of wildlife, but nothing moved like that. Nothing looked like that. Just then, my wife stirred in the passenger seat. She mumbled something about where we were, starting to wake up. I panicked. I didn't want her involved in this, didn't want to scare her or have her think I was losing my mind. "I gotta go," I told the guy abruptly. "Wait," he said, reaching into his pocket. "Let me give you my number. We should report this to—" "I really have to go," I cut him off, already rolling up my window. I saw the confusion on his face as I pulled away, but I couldn't deal with it right then. My wife yawned and stretched beside me. "Did we stop? Where are we?" "Just pulled over to check the map," I lied. "Go back to sleep if you want. Still early." She nodded and closed her eyes again. I drove with white knuckles for the next 2 hours, constantly checking the rearview mirror. We continued our trip, saw the redwoods, drove down to San Francisco, flew home. I never told her. I've never told anyone until now. I've spent countless nights researching, looking at wildlife reports from coastal Oregon, reading about bears and misidentified animals. I've gone down every rabbit hole trying to rationalize what I saw, but nothing fits. I kick myself constantly for not getting that other driver's contact information. The only other person who could verify what I saw, and I drove away from him because I was too shaken to think straight. Sometimes I wonder if he reported it, if there's some record in a park ranger's file or local sheriff's report about a sighting that morning. I've thought about calling authorities in that area, but what would I even say? How do I explain that I saw something impossible on a foggy Oregon beach over a year ago? I can't explain what was on that beach that morning. I can't explain why it was examining seaweed or why it seemed so angry at my presence. I can't explain the way it moved or those eyes that seemed too aware, too intelligent. All I know is I saw something that shouldn't exist, and I'm still trying to make sense of it. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, convinced those eyes are watching me through our bedroom window. My wife asks what's wrong, and I always blame it on work stress or bad dreams, but I know what I saw, and somewhere out there, so does that driver in the pickup truck.